And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. Oh, what a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room tonight already. Of course, I am joined tonight by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, this must be like wild astrology or something.
Oh, well, it's eclipse season.
Got all kinds of wild things going on. Well, the eclipses, do we already have them, or there's one coming up?
We had an eclipse on, oh God, where are we? On the 25th, we had a new moon eclipse. And then on election day, we're having a full moon eclipse.
Okay, so that's coming up, the big hardcore one. Because there's so many strange things that are happening, it's got to be in the stars.
Absolutely.
I do feel like tonight's episode is going to be kind of special. This is X Series 137, and it's going into the Atlantis Automatons. And we've touched on this now in a couple of episodes. Tonight we're going to go really deep on it. And we got started on that last time and ran out of time to complete the circle on it. But it's a crucial factor when considering all of the kind of AI symbiotic imagery that we've been seeing, and the development of clones, the development of cyborgs, the development of these robots, the automation, the killer robots. The San Diego Police Department just made a petition to try to get their robots armed. I mean, so we're going into Mad Max Terminator, but it's not in the movies anymore. So we need to get a handle on what this automation's about, and that it doesn't just come in unawares when we're looking at it from an esoteric level. We're going to dive deep into that tonight, which is the Atlantis Automaton. This is the DNA cult of Belial secret that the mystery schools preserved, and that came out through that wave of mystery information that we got, and that we're still, I would say, working through in the 21st century and sort of developing a whole new vocabulary for. We're going to be taking your questions tonight in the second half of the program, and I want to remind you that you can ask the questions now. Olivia is going to put those together, and while you're at it, go and sign up for our free newsletter at the darkjournalist.com website. We've just had incredible reports of censorship. Whenever everyone is searching for our stuff, I get these horror stories. But the best thing to do then is just to make sure that you're on the newsletter list. Then you get that in your inbox, and you get that once a week. There's no marketing or anything like that. It's just straight ahead letting you know the incredible, important interviews and X series episodes that we have coming up for you. In terms of the questions, you can ask them now, and Olivia will put them together for the second part of the show. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Oregon Sunshine wants to know, are Yuval Noah Harari's, quote, hackable animals and automatons one and the same?
There's no question. This is the actual stream of thought. And Harari is a particularly good example because he's on the psychotic side and power mad, like Schwab, but, he's like a weird, younger, crazier strain. And, they have him on shows as if they're rolling him out like Carl Sagan or somebody, and, best-selling book and all that stuff. Look, this stuff is all arranged. This guy is a serious psychopath. And his view is this kind of godless, gutless humanity that can be controlled, and that forget about, freedom, and forget about your spirituality. We own you with technology. And it's interesting. I would say what's the difference with a guy like that versus the traditional kind of people that built this whole program up over decades, like the Rockefellers and such, is that they didn't say it out loud. And now, they've gone drunk on their own Kool-Aid at this point. They're very happy to come out and talk about their plans. So we hear this once in a while. Just like we hear governors saying, I can call martial law. No, you can't. Constitution. I got one right here. I'll show you what it reads. But, we do get into this, and I think people like Harari and Schwab and Gates, that whole thing is the transhumanist piece connects directly into the automaton theme that Edgar Cayce was trying to give us with his mystery school knowledge. It's there in Theosophy. It's there in the Steiner work. But I think that Cayce crafts it in a way that is the most easily understandable. However, I have all three streams of that activity tonight. We're going to have Blavatsky on this, Steiner, and Cayce, and that's going to give us that really kind of full approach. I'm also going to talk about a very obscure and interesting salon activity that was going on in the 1890s in France, which was basically the Theatre de Mystery School, which had art and performance and music and the whole thing. And the people behind that were part of a very interesting exsteganography group that dealt with art, and half of them looked like they were on the right hand path, and the other half looked like they were on the left hand path in terms of the esoteric occultism that was used. But they're very fascinating, and they relate directly to this chimerical aspect that we're looking at in the transhumanism in art, and they've got the deep symbolism down. We remember in the Tree of Life and in some of these earlier mystical teachings, Kabbalah and others, that it's the androgyne that really brings this home. And so we're looking at a sexless figure when we look at angels and things of this nature. So there's some kind of weird reversal that goes on when we are in the deep kind of black occult territory, where they spin that around and it becomes the kind of avoided zombie, a kind of a cyborg figure. And that is what apparently happens in Atlantean times when we go into the Akasha Chronicle through the figure of Edgar Cayce and also through Rudolf Steiner and Blavatsky. They're giving us the path and the hint there, and they're looking out in their time period, and they're seeing what we're going to face in the 21st century, and they're saying we're going to load them up with this. When the time comes, boom, they're going to have a foundation. So they're also doing the best that they can. You know, I heard someone discussing Nostradamus the other day and saying, well, this would have all been simple had he just put it, you know, said it very plainly or something. You know, there are factors to consider, and there are centuries for which he's writing for. And so those things, you know, I mean, if he had come out and made a lot of his predictions, they probably would have burnt him at the stake back then. So we have to kind of consider these things and read the tea leaves on that. Would you not agree?
I would agree. Absolutely.
Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep tonight on the automatons and the Atlantis AI connection, that cult of Belial that we have covered in the Maxwell episodes, dealing with Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein and their fascination around this and their link to it. It's, you know, about 1% of the information that we have on this is out there. So we're bringing it forward through these shows. So I'm going to start off by getting us into what we're talking about in terms of the things. I do actually have a couple of things to report on the UFO File side. And something extraordinary did happen there. And I still feel like this is their chief aim in terms of emergency powers and the things that they're trying to put forward. But they've had a lot of problems on the intelligence side pushing for the UFO threat op. But they've got themselves into trouble by the characters that they've used that we've highlighted on this program, counterintelligence people, who I think they can, you know, they're constantly repackaging, and their packaging might just be getting stale at this point. But something interesting came up. The same people earlier on in 2017 that brought us this UFO File threat action and the whole 2017, oh, you know, we have a new UFO thing and the New York Times is covering it, and UAP and all this stuff. So that whole group, the CIA counterintelligence group, Elizondo Mellon and Jim Semivans, a 25-year lifer there at the CIA, they came out with that December 16th, 2017. And it's interesting because the New York Times was the conduit. Now, here we are, just a couple months shy of their 5-year anniversary of launching this thing. And they've done a lot to kind of muddy the waters. They've done a lot to launch a UFO threat and seize emergency powers and things of this nature, and to create this whole kind of false disclosure idea away from the genuine research around UFO files. Two very, very different things. New York Times article today Many military UFO reports are just foreign spying or, watch closely, airborne trash. That's the actual headline from the article. And this is fascinating. Their foreign policy correspondent. And this basically takes the New York Times off the hook for the junk conspiracy that they promoted with the Elizondo and TTSA and all that. This is their response. And I'll tell you, the fact that they use the word trash in there means they're trashing, and the old op is trash, basically. So the change in tone there we have to be very aware of, because earlier we had the UFO threat thing going full force, launched by the New York Times through Fox TV, CNN, Politico, you know, and now all the same people are emerging and they're changing that message. They're promoting Ryan Graves, who's a Navy pilot, and they're promoting Gary Nolan, who's a big Fauci immunologist over there at Stanford. And he's also a contactee, by the way. I'm going to buy that one. Now, but what's particularly interesting to me is this Elizondo piece that came out. Now, remember, he was the big one on the UFO threat thing, which was supposed to be, oh, the UFO threat is here, so you need to give us all your power and create this Office of UFO Defense and all this kind of thing. Well, now, check out the change in tone from a recent Lou article. And so they're talking about a man who once headed a little-known government program to gather and analyze information about UAP, said that he has changed in the last 4 years, and now the United States has admitted to the clandestine program, and now that many government personnel are required to report UAP sightings through official channels. So there's this whole buildup of him as this former official who formerly led this thing. First of all, he's not former anything, as I've pointed out. He still works for the Pentagon. He did then, he did in between, he does now. So there's no former Pentagon whistleblower or anything. But what's interesting is listen to the change in tone. Think about that trash thing. Keep that in the back of your mind. Now this is Elizondo. We're here today because your government is now taking this as a national security issue. Not a national security threat, but a national security issue. Now, he has backed off the threat language because, you know, we in the media and the alternative media have exposed him. A very small corridor of us have done that. And you in the ideas room have spread that message. But you can see that part of it, they need to kind of recalibrate. And so now they're really hot to trot on the Oumuamua AI thing and Gary Nolan and our good old Abby Loeb over there at Harvard. Now, Oumuamua, of course, means scout ship. And the idea is that big rock that came in from another galaxy was a ship. And it was trying to communicate AI to us saying, planet Earth, don't destroy yourself. Develop carbon taxes for your citizens. And this is where they're going with that one. So they want to formulate this, but when we see the change now in the New York Times itself, that, you know, airborne trash, that's what they're thinking of their old op now. That's a very significant shift. And then when you see the counter intel shift from Elizondo, you know, the CIA puppet boy for 20 years, he's running around now. He's saying it's not a threat. It's what? It's a national security issue. And what does Ryan Graves say? The latest one, who came through Leslie Kane, who has been around there in that UFO world for a while. And she helped launch, she wrote the article for the New York Times that launched all this nonsense. What does Ryan Graves have to say? Well, he says, well, it's not a threat issue. You know what it is? It's a safety issue. We're not safe when we're flying around. There are UFOs up there too. So now they're switching that. And you know how they always work it out? Well, you know, the COVID restrictions are for your safety, the vaccines for your safety, and all these different means. So now they have safety and science, right, with Gary Nolan. So watching how they piece these things together and really taking a look at the train tracks of how, you know, these things map out together is crucial. I wanted to point out that there's a theme going on here, which is, you know, Elizondo was supposed to have a bio movie and a book out by now. And
yeah, what happened to that?
I was looking forward to seeing it, especially the poor whistleblower comes forward. So all those things are shelved. I guess Greenwald from the Black Vault went ahead and got in touch with the publishing company and said, is this thing, you know, coming out, because I want to review it. And they said, well, there's no release date. for this stuff. I find that interesting. This was interesting to me. Now, this is Leslie Kean, who was Bud Hopkins' partner, and Bud Hopkins did fantastic work in abductions. And then when she does all this work with these CIA people, she never mentions Bud Hopkins and the great work that he did. So that's strange. And I have to just, on the record say that her governor, her uncle is the governor of New York, of New Jersey, Thomas Kean, and he was the head of the 9/11 Commission. So, we have to kind of instantly, there's a political piece to this. She's connected to that whole political gang, and that's all right. You can be born into that and be interested in UFOs, but when you start doing things and it becomes very convenient for intelligence agencies to use you as their prop person, then it becomes a different story. Then, investigative reporters are going to look a little bit more decently at it. And also, I've invited these people for gentlemen's debate on this show before. So it's not like I just want to dialogue about them. But there's a good reason why they're not going to come on. But anyway, this is very interesting about Leslie Kean. So the series that she put together was her and Elizondo, and it was all this thing, and it was UFO and CNN and all this stuff. And then suddenly they just dropped it. And so you started hearing all these announcements. Oh, there are delays. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Now she has to come forward and say something. So on her public Facebook, she writes, our CNN series on UAP is on hold only because of the upheaval caused by the merger of HBO and CNN. There's a restructuring. People are getting fired. Budgets are changing. There is only one reason for the delay, and our series is not the only one facing this frustrating set of circumstances. There is no conspiracy! ! I found that very, very interesting because these projects now, the CIA has withdrawn their support. The establishment has withdrawn their support because they can't accomplish the same things using players like this. They had guys like Elizondo out there going into interviews with people on podcasts. And then when they said something that he didn't appreciate, he would say, oh, your mom's a hooker or whatever, so they had these loose cannons and it wasn't working. Now they're trying this kinder, gentler Lou. And they've got Dr. Nolan, big Fauci supporter, saying, I was an abductee. And so the CIA wave has reset itself from UFO threat to UFO safety. This is interesting. I think they will revert back to threat because it's their best card. But nonetheless, that wave is something that we're keeping a very close eye on. And Nolan, in particular, you would say in terms of the UFO op launched by the intelligence agencies, of which he is a part of the CIA, admitted. And, it's not one of those things that's debatable. It's in his bio, CIA guy. Got it? And I do find that interesting. It's a weird reluctance. Like, no, he's not CIA. Yes, he is. Mm-hmm. And, it was interesting, I would say, back in the past, the CIA used to use people, and they'd use authors and these other people, and they wouldn't say, hey, don't disclose your connection to the CIA. Now they're all tied in there. So that's very different. Another piece, I think, which is important to watch is the $10 million donation that was given by Bigelow Aerospace to our friend Governor DeSantis in Florida. This is a particularly big move. There's a Bloomberg article about it that just came out. DeSantis's biggest donor is a budget hotel tycoon with a passion for UFOs. Now, there's all kinds of interesting things in there. One, they were saying that basically DeSantis is number 2 to Trump in terms of fundraising. He's raised $164 million. Trump has $290 million on hand for a political campaign. We see where that goes. But it's interesting. There's a couple of key pieces in this Bloomberg article. I reported this connection last August about DeSantis and our friend Bigelow. But anyway, here we go. In the early 2000s, this is from Bloomberg now. The article is actually from today. Bigelow found an ally in Senator Harry Reid, the late senator, majority leader, who had an interest in UFOs. He was the Senate majority leader from Nevada, and that was the home of Area 51. He was very aware of the whole thing. And so him, coming forward and saying, like, that government needs to give us alien disclosure through Lou Elizondo, he was running Area 51 as the senator from Nevada. So, he was the government. This is the thing that we have to kind of get rid of the myths. And they think that they can fool, like, Wired magazine, and they can fool these publications because those people don't know anything about UFOs. They can fool Tucker Carlson or whatever. But, let's get serious here. By mid-2009, Bigelow Aerospace's experts had written 26 research reports on phenomena such as invisibility, wormholes in space-time, antimatter energy, and signature reduction warp drives, according to DIA documents. In 2010, the Federal Aviation Administration directed air traffic controllers and pilots to report UAP phenomena to Bigelow Aerospace. So they were getting all the reports way before this ATIP nonsense, making the company the government's go-to depository for UFO sightings. In the last 2 years, Bigelow has ramped up political donations, and he didn't stop at $10 million for DeSantis campaign finance disclosures show. So he's gone, here comes the money train for DeSantis. Why is Bigelow giving DeSantis so much money? Well, it's true that in Florida, he's on the Space Coast there, but Bigelow's operations are in Nevada and, spread out there in the Southwest. This is very interesting to me, but he obviously wants to be in good with DeSantis, who he perceives is going to be doing well in the future. But that, let's face it, that's fascinating. What do you got?
Nothing so far.
Okay, good. Everyone, I want you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter. It keeps us in touch, and it's going to help us beat the censorship on that one. By the way, one last thing to mention there about the UFO piece is all the Mar-a-Lago stuff, this whole thing about classified documents and all the rest. Do you notice that when Bigelow and Chris Mellon got together and they said, we have these fantastic, meetings, and we smuggled out all this classified data. That's how you got the Tic Tac video and all that stuff. Well, hey, isn't this the stuff that they're trying to take President Trump to court for? So when we think about that, then what are we really talking about here? Shouldn't those guys then, I guess, be hauled before, should they have their place raided? Should there be a SWAT team coming down on them for that? Well, the stuff that they showed has classified markings, and they said, well, Mellon said, I got it from a Pentagon official in a parking lot trying to pretend for his TV show that it was like Watergate. So if that's true, then I guess you're going to have to raid them too. Sorry, Merrick Garland. It's tough to be out there these days in a political environment. We all heard about the thing of our friend Musk taking over for Twitter, and we're all going to hold our breath on that one. I got two interesting things about Musk, but one of them, which I thought was significant, was Trump saying, I'm staying on Truth Social, I'm not going over to Twitter. There's a significance there as well. And he also said that Twitter, had indicated to him that they were going to give him his Twitter account back next week. So he's basically saying, I don't want it. That could be significant on a couple of levels. And that would be, I would say, a story to watch. Remember, the Trump piece in relation to this whole thing about 2024, the election process, and how important Twitter being taken over by Musk could be. Now, we all know the terrible story that floated just before I went live here about Pelosi and this very unusual thing about her husband and this break-in attack. I don't, beyond just the very sketchy, bare details, I don't know anything about it. And whatever it is, I hope we get kind of a real breakdown on it. But one thing I will say that's significant and just odd is that just before, 18 hours before, The Verge, which is, one of those publications, it's kind of like Wired, they had done a story on how terrible it was going to be with Elon Musk taking over for Twitter. And this is the graphic that they used. This is 18 hours before all this stuff happened with Pelosi. Isn't that just strange, as you can see?
I think it's really creepy.
I mean, it's unusual. It's just probably like a weird happenstance, but a bunch of hammers, and then we have a hammer attack. And then when we're hearing more about this story about the Pelosi break-in, it turns out that it was basically a hammer fight with Paul Pelosi having a hammer and then the intruder having a hammer. So a lot of weirdness around that whole thing, but I found hammers and, this kind of imagery just odd, let's say, coming up the way that it did. The last thing I'll mention in relation to what's been going on just in general, before we dive right into the show, is this thing about the Mary Farrell Foundation suing for the JFK records. This is significant because the Mary Farrell Foundation has, a lot of donors. It's significant. It's been around for 3 decades, and they are suing the Biden administration that if he doesn't release the JFK records on December 22nd, the way that they're supposed to come down, they have him in court saying the National Archives and Biden both need to surrender those documents. Interestingly enough, the National Archives is in this suit, but the National Archives is the one also bringing the suit against President Trump. So now that's what's intriguing to me when we think about this, because we know that Trump had definitely seen the JFK records, and he'd spoken to Judge Napolitano about how shocking it is what's in there, and no one would ever believe it. So when we think about that, and then we think about the National Archives using this very thin kind of maneuver to get him into legal jeopardy, and then we think about his problems with them, and then suddenly the National Archives is being sued by this group along with the Biden administration. You want to connect those dots together, be my guest, because for me, it's unmistakable that there's something going on with those cards in the back room, and we're keeping a close eye on it right now. Although on the surface, I think that Trump is being hit with a lot of legal thunder, that actually in the background, I see more and more maneuvering in his favor. So I don't know if that's because they think it's inevitable in terms of 2024, the outcome with this disastrous economy, and, Biden being just acting like he has no brain and like automaton, basically.
Exactly.
They might think it's inevitable this guy gets back in there, and there might be forces that are doing that. And then there are other forces that are saying inevitably we can never have this guy in there again. And regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, it's very important to watch the way that the deep state handles this situation, because they may get too much exposure and a little too much light. And you know what they say about that? It's a little too much light means a little too much heat. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's X Series 137. We're going into the Atlantis Automatons. We'll be taking your questions, part 2 of the show. And I'm going to start off with some readings through the figure of Edgar Cayce and what he had to say about this period of time that we're reflecting on, which seems to have come back around. And the idea basically is that, we get into mystery schools, occult societies, esoteric secret societies. We're looking at groups that have held knowledge for thousands of years. And in the case of the Rosicrucians, this is a tradition that goes all the way back to 2,000 years. And then when you go back to what spawned, like the Essenes and the whole Christian mysticism, that came out of the Egyptian mystery school, and where the Egyptian Book of the Dead mystery school comes directly out of that Atlantean tradition. And then right out of that Egyptian tradition comes the school of the prophets, Elijah, and all these things. So we've had this crisscross going on. It tracked through Babylonia, it tracked through Sumeria, and it tracked on the other side through the Mayans and the Incas and the Aztecs, etc. But it's a deep knowledge on the spiritual significance of happenings on planet Earth and of the future of humanity, the evolution of humanity, and the interaction with these higher spiritual forces. By the time we get around to the early 20th century, which is the period that Edgar Cayce operates in, you're hearing through the lens of the end of this kind of wild ride of the 19th century. And what's coming out of that, there's a lot of information about Atlantis that's coming to the surface. James Churchward would come forward and give us information about Mu, which is a Lemurian counterpart, to Atlantis. Gigi Young just did a show on this. And what was amazing about that actually is they did one of those ridiculous, they do these to me all the time, but I was shocked to see it on Gigi's video. They put a disclaimer saying, here's the context for lizard people.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about anything now and you're going to get some kind of a context meter from these guys. Absolutely outrageous. I also wanted to say it's weird. Gigi did a video on, Lemuria and lizard people, literally getting into it, no holds barred. And the New York Times ran an article on lizards on their front page today. It's just so weird.
Wow.
This is why I say this must be weird astrology going on.
Just lizards or lizard
No,
people?
not lizard people.
But
lizards.
just lizards.
Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Think about that. So, I don't know, but very fascinating video as well. And I highly recommend it. But what was interesting to me is that the Lemurian piece is to think about, humanity not even fully grounded in physical bodies yet. By the time you're in Atlantis, you're a lot more fleshed out, less than we are now. Right now, we've densified. This is a very dense stage for humanity. And if you go through that lens of the mysteries, when you're going back into the Atlantean times, it seems that there's very supernormal, superhuman abilities that are being utilized and developed. And that's what the Atlanteans were famous for. So they developed a very high technology, but also a very high psychic ability. And they were able to use their minds to control the weather and things of this nature. So by the time we get around to Cayce giving us this information, he is going into retrocognitive states where he can read the Akashic record and see all the things that have gone in the past with Atlantis. And he's saying a lot of this that went on in that period is coming back around again so humanity can face it this time and not destroy itself, because that is what took place at the end of Atlantis. I've pointed out that so many things that are the foundation of this show, like X-steganography, apophthegm, things of this nature, all come from that direct blowout of Atlantis and the mystery school knowledge being carried on after the fact. So from the beginning of the show right through this one, there's that thread of the Atlantean aspect is going to be so crucial to how everything goes now at the future. And we're on the precipice in so many different places, whether it's Ukraine or food shortages or whatever it happens to be, the nuclear fear, that this is a particularly interesting time for us to reflect on what the mystery schools have left us for this battle that's taking place. What do you got over there?
Space Ghost said, how much do I have to donate to make DJ go full lizard?
Yeah, well, I think, the way I look at certain subjects, there's enough information out there, I think, that people can get through. But it's very interesting. If you were to take the Cayce readings around automatons literally, and I do, you would see that the Atlanteans developed cyborgs. They developed chimerical animal mixtures. And then there's so many legends about this stuff that spawn after, that come through, like the Greek myths and the Egyptian myths, the Sphinx and all this type of thing, that when we get right to it, we can see that this is a reflection, an echo of something that took place. Because remember now, even when we think about something that happened in 2000 BC, it's so far away from us and so remote that we can barely comprehend it. How'd you like to go back 10,500 years and really figure out what's going on? I was thinking about all over Harvard Square, there are these posters where they want you to wave your phone at that barcode that they have, and you'll get all this information. They're doing this with everything pretty much. I mean, any restaurant you go into, you wave your phone, and that's how you get your menu. But looking at all these posters, I was like, in even like 10, 20 years, is anyone going to know what that thing means? Never mind 10,000 years. And then I look at things like hieroglyphs, and I think, we think we figured these out. We think we understand the language, significance, and all the rest. But if you imagine the types of technologies we've developed in just a very short period of time, of waving in front of some design, an electrical device, and getting a whole download of information about all these other things. What are we looking at when it comes to some of the older technology?
Right. It's like the little handbags.
Yes, exactly. And do you want to describe
No,
it?
I just they're Mesopotamian, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. They're all over the place. And what's great is that Graham Hancock has done something significantly tracking what they would represent, but they always came out of the sea originally. And in fact, they would have the covering of a fish. They would have a fish outfit, but it would be like a human being in a Halloween costume talking out of a fish outfit. So something, I think the message there is that they came from a sunken sea land. Well, it's interesting because if you go into some of the early references to Atlantis, they came directly through Helena Blavatsky, who was the Russian mystic who founded the Theosophical Society and who brought forward The Secret Doctrine, 2 volumes, Isis Unveiled, 2 volumes, and just blew the end of the 19th century away with all of this deep mysticism that she was bringing forward and giving the foundation for anthroposophy, which, originally Steiner was a theosophist with Besant, and he was one of the lead theosophists in Germany before he saw the society around theosophy going wrong and developed anthroposophy. But that link, nonetheless, is significant. And he didn't disavow all of theosophies or the Theosophical Society's teachings. What he did very specifically is he said, there were initiators at the cradle of this movement, but the movement itself has gone wrong. So he understood the significance of it, which is why he was a part of it for so many years, over a decade. But Blavatsky tells us something very interesting. She says, well, one of the main things that made the Atlanteans invincible is nobody could approach the island. There wasn't a way to do it. There's some kind of force field around Atlantis that didn't allow ships to just roll in there. That is very significant. And she went further, saying what they did was they developed a worldwide cavern system. That's how they would let their friends in, through these caverns. So there's a massive underwater, underground network that existed. That's how they basically developed, this invincibility, that nobody could actually approach them. Now, I've heard stories in dealing with the whole underground world aspect about people who were working on projects, and this goes back to the 40s and 50s when they were building out highways across America and stuff, and they would run into a place underground, and they'd go in, and they would see a totally tunneled out, futuristic looking system down there and be like, who built this? And when they were building the COG, continuity of government bunkers, they'd run into these things too. Now we can get a better idea that even the underground societies that we've built up, all of this has been done before as well. So we're running into ourselves over and over again. When we get into the things that Blavatsky brought forward, we also can see that there's one thread there that theosophy leads to this Atlantis question. The Atlantis question opens up at the end of the 19th century. And by the time we're into Cayce's work, he's in the 1920s, 1930s, giving these readings, telling us not only did Atlantis exist, but guess what? It's coming back. And it's coming back with all the technology that it had, and it's coming back basically through the same people who did it. They're all reincarnating, and they're going to come in, and they're very exceptional, the Atlanteans. Remember, they have all this scientific knowledge, and they're back. So this is the setup for the story as we get into it. Now, there's a period there at the end with Atlantis where Cayce's doing these readings, and he starts to talk about how when the Atlanteans are leaving their own sunken islands, there are only 3 islands left, Arion, Og, and Poseidia at the end. And when they leave these islands and they come into different places like South America or Egypt or America, they're bringing with them these things or automatons. And that there's always a problem in relation to this in the native cultures. One, the natives very quickly under the Atlanteans get classified the same as the automatons. So that means they're treating the automatons like robots. So you're basically a slave. You're going to do what we say. And there's a problem with it because the Atlanteans have this thing where they're not really doing anything. They're having everyone do it for them. And in some cases, I was reading about one of these automatons who was a pilot. So they have them trained and educated to such a level where they can take on very complicated tasks, but they do all the kind of, regular grunt labor, work in the fields and all this kind of stuff as well. So it's very interesting about the origins of the automatons, the things, as he refers to them as automatons, things, and untouchables at other times. Because when you look at the history he's trying to give us of who they are and how they got there, it's very unusual, but they're devised, they're created. And I picked out a couple of particular readings that might give us an idea of where they came from and what happened to them ultimately. Because at a certain point, it seems like there's a very sophisticated program to bring them into the family of humanity. And they are basically becoming these vessels for souls, but they're not full human vessels because they've been created by these Atlantean scientists. This is the story, the advanced kind of erudite theme that Cayce is giving us very early on. Some of the Atlantean readings come from 1920. So, we're looking at something where it's not very well explained in theosophy, but it opens up dramatically by the time you get to the Cayce work. There's a lot of threads about it in theosophy, and there's great information about Atlantis there. But until you get to the Cayce work, you don't get the full flowering of it. I'm going to read from some of those Cayce readings dealing with the automatons and see if we can kind of position this properly. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist X Series 137. We're going deep tonight on Atlantis Automatons, the DNA secret, and the Belial cult. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of tonight's show. And Miss Olivia, before I jump in with the readings, you're up.
Flippinek says, androids and robots were part of the cruise Adamski observed on board the saucers. And George Ivankovich says, grays are automatons.
Yeah. It's very interesting about grays because I think that there's a whole piece there which is very much like the automaton story that we're getting from Atlantis. And then, I've told this story about Caycean readings getting questions about, well, describe the types of advanced ship that the Atlanteans have. And him saying, well, this is like what Ezekiel described at a much later date. And we know Ezekiel described these incredible wheel within a wheel ships. And the question is, Ezekiel basically like 3000 BC, probably as far back as he goes. So who is operating that technology from 10,500 BC in between? Who's holding on to it for 7,500 years? It's a very significant piece that comes up in the Cayce readings. And again, I want to say this about the Cayce readings. Incredible things have happened through what's been released through the ARE and different authors about Cayce, but they have not touched on the edginess and the informative esoteric insight of the Atlantean period that he lays down. And it's just kind of waiting there in space for us to get a handle on it. And his descriptions of the two groups, the Amilius group that was fighting against the Sons of Belial group. So that clash, the spiritual clash versus the kind of scientific materialism, it seems to be the exact same clash that we've walked into in the period that we're in right now. So I'm going to read a couple of these, and hopefully we get a better idea of what the things, the automatons are, their origin. And some of this, I think, gets us to it. So I've picked out 4 select readings. Here's just a little piece of it. So he's reading, some of these people are coming in for readings, and they're looking to see what past life association that they had with Cayce. And in other cases, they're looking to see what past lives, what they did, what they developed. And Cayce will give them a whole rundown on the lives that they lived. So this is the reincarnation piece that opens up in the Cayce readings as well. You'll find it in Theosophy. You'll find it in the Steiner work. This is a hallmark of the mystery teaching. So he's talking about this, and he says, well, before this, the entity was in the Atlantean land during those periods just before the second upheaval. Remember, there's a series of destructions in Atlantis, not just one. There, the entity was among the children of the law of one and attempting to embrace in the services and the activities those things. Remember, things is very often spelled out either capitalized or in quotes. So he's making an emphasis when he says things. Or the evolutionary individuals in the land by the decisions of the sons of Belial. So the Belial group has created the automatons, the things. And he's referring to them here as evolutionary individuals. So they're plotting their own kind of evolution, the Belial scientists, using the Amilius information. One quick thing I should insert here is that Amilius, in the Cayce readings, in the Cayce cosmology, he comes forward and he develops a whole different way for the Atlanteans. And what happens is that flowers a culture of high technology that has interactions in the technology itself with higher beings from the outer spheres, the way he describes it, the angelic realm. So the same way that you or I communicate with someone on a laptop, these people are opening up their laptop and, getting angelic communication. They train priestesses to kind of go through this process of the two-eye stone where they integrate to the stone and receive the messages. So they become like a living radio receiver. Now, they also are in an incredibly spiritual, enlightened state. And the state of Earth is different. It's not so densified. So, it's harder, maybe a little harder for us to imagine this happening. But at one point, he actually says that they are tuned like a radio and they're receiving the signal this way. So that's how the Amilius group are using the technology. On the other side, the Belial group is very imitative. They imitate the Amilius group, but they're not as well developed. And their tendency is to utilize the advantages that they get and dominate physically. So what happens is the Belial group takes from the Amilius group and then works out on other cultures and dominates them. And so there sets up a big clash between how the things that have been developed under the Amilius group, now through all the Atlanteans, there's a split between those two groups. Now we've experienced this split ourselves, since the advent of scientific materialism. And the other kind of theme that goes on here is the abuse of the leaders and the rulership against the people and against the automatons themselves. They use them in a very abusive fashion. Now you would think, well, if it's just a cyborg, what does it matter? Well, there's a strange thing that goes on here, and we have to attribute this to a kind of esoteric knowledge. But somehow the automatons are becoming vessels that souls are getting trapped in because there's human matter that's being used. And so in some cases, what's happening is from the readings themselves, there's an animal factor where they're mixing animal culture in with this. And this is what he calls a projection that takes place. Now, scientifically, the language for projection is pretty interesting. And I think it is open to interpretation. I'm going to give you a few of the interpretations for that.
Can I throw
tonight
something
as
in
well.
there?
Yes.
The other thing, you just reminded me of Findhorn and how this comes up in, what is the movie that we love? My Dinner with Andre. So that they have names for everything, including refrigerators, because you wouldn't want to be abusive to Pamela, for example.
Oh yeah, yes.
Because by naming it, you actually treat it more like a human being, and it actually helps you in your consciousness.
That's interesting,
right?
Yes.
Your compassion, your awareness, your
it
responsibility.
Is, yeah. And that's kind of fascinating too. We get into this when people who talk to plants, for example, Cayce was very big on talking to plants. So there's a whole aspect there of interaction. What's interesting, though, when you think about the automatons, is there's a percentage of humanity in them. So they're definitely cyborg material, that they've been simultaneously, they're a mix of human and machine, or human and animal. So this creates kind of a really big problem, because all the different cultures that the Atlanteans roll into after the destruction look at them and see, oh, not only are they abusing these guys, they're going to abuse us like they're abusing them. So those are predominantly, the wider group of Belial Atlanteans, not the traditional Amilius group. So, you have good and evil, and then kind of a lot of people in between. And he runs into them when he does these readings. A few more readings to give us a handle on this. All right. So there's a war against these groups, and the war takes Atlantis down, or it starts to set off volcanic activity. It starts to set off destruction of their own power plants through the Two-Eye Stone and the misuse of the stone. So this plays out. This is part of the history agenda that we're seeing that plays out in that period of time. And he actually gives us a time frame for the second disturbance of the destruction. The first destruction is 50,722 BC. The second destruction is 28,000 years BC. And then the final one that takes everyone down is 10,500 BC. That's pretty specific, and there's probably ways to kind of match the geological record against those dates. Further into the readings, here we go. The Atlanteans were becoming decadent, or being broken up, owing to the disputes between the children of the Law of One, the Amilius group, and the children of Belial. This entity was in Atlantis when there were those divisions and the breaking up of the land that had been promised through the activities of the children of the Law of One. The entity was now among those who chose to enter as leaders in what is now called the Yucatan. The Yucatan was going to be New Atlantis. And the entity aided in establishing the temple through which there was hoped would be the appearance again of the children of the Law of One, the Amilius group. As they listened to the oracles that came through the stones, the crystals that were prepared for communications in what you now know as radio. So there they are, tuning to the various stations, trying to get back in touch with this higher angelic communication that they had before all this took place. So we get into, there's a little bit more here. Let's see, I selected a few. Okay, this will give us an idea of the day-to-day life of this activity. The entity was in the Atlant, now known as the Atlantean, during those periods when there were the questions arising, much as may be termed in the land today in a local section, as to the acknowledgement of the castes in a land where the untouchables were considered as but dogs among the higher castes. The untouchables, again, untouchables, things, automatons, they're all the same group. The entity was in the position then of attempting to gain for the untouchables an approach for their own self-development during that period. So we have to imagine then, like, let's suppose that the World Economic Forum just continues on this scientific binge that it goes on. And then what happens is they develop ways, they have all these puberty blockers, and they just start to make basically sexless beings. And then after a while, those beings don't reproduce, but are just put in a kind of perpetual activity of doing work for these people. And then the next level of that is, they make them last a very long time physically, but they are not being able to give them the full human expression. And then that just becomes generation after generation. That's what was taking place back there. It's the same mistake that we're, kind of devolving into in the middle of all this. But I think that will let us get our heads wrapped around, because he's almost talking about it like social work when they go and they try to rehabilitate the automatons. Okay, this is interesting. There's a word in here that's so modern. I thought it was interesting. Watch this. Now, the entity was in the Atlantean land when there was the breaking up of the isles, and it had been given out that those who would be saved must journey forth to the various centers to which the leaders had been given the passports. What's that all about? It's very modern language. The entity was among those who came first to what is now the Pyrenees, and later in the activities head to the Egyptian land. The entity was in the Atlantean role. The entity then won high in authority, being the ruler of the land during the age of advanced forces seen in the Earth's plane. The entity ruled well, developed much until the again forces of the entering of others from the outer spheres. So there's some other group that gets involved, and they're involved from outer spheres. The entity became selfish in the last period. And this is interesting too, because even when you have these extraordinary, descriptions on Cayce's side telling us about these things, he's always bringing it down to a personal level. What did the person do with the experience? How did they handle being around this super cosmic environment? And you almost hear about the details about the environment in an incidental fashion, because so much of it is about, did the person gain or lose in this extraordinary activity? A few more hints about this period of time again. Entity was in the Atlantean land during those periods when there was the breaking up and the journeying to the various lands. The entity was among those who came into what is now the Yucatan land, again Yucatan, later journeying with many of those peoples to the southwest portions of Arizona. Again, that Atlantean Arizona connection we brought up before. As now known through the experience, the entity was among those who made use of spiritual laws for material affectation, not so much in the abuse as in the negligence in supplying or aiding others that were of this group of things to attain greater awareness. So in one of these cases, we have these Atlantean groups bringing the things with them, not only into Egypt, but here they are. They go first into Yucatan with the automatons, and now they're going to Arizona with the automatons. So the automatons then spread out everywhere that the Atlanteans are, because they do all the work for the Atlanteans. As I said, they're their pilots, they're their gardeners, they're their artisans, they are architects, and they can be developed to a very high point of being suited for a particular task. So, for me, I think it's appropriate to look at them as a very specific type of integrated human machine. And that's how I think he's describing them best. And then he talks about how, a lot of this is taking place and they're utilizing abilities that would seem fantastic for people there in that period. He's discussing it, the early 20s. And then he says, well, in the land of Atlantis, often the entity laid aside the physical body to become regenerated in its activities in the material associations, even from those periods of the beginnings of the destructive influence that arose from the sons of Belial through the activities of Beelzebub. So there he's using the term straight up outright, but separating it, Belial and Beelzebub. So this is interesting to me because we get Steiner's vision of Ahriman, which comes up through Persian mythology as the evil influence. But then he's applying it and bringing it back for the 20th century and saying Ahriman is the force that humanity is going to contend with in the 21st century. Some of the usage of these terms, and he's also splitting evil into Ahrimanic and Luciferian. So that's also something that is coming directly from the mystery centers. We have to start to wonder, what are we getting there? What kind of language are they having us change our own vocabulary from? And how do we advance from just a simple straight ahead kind of, either scientific materialism vocabulary on one hand, which rejects the whole thing, or a super religious point of view, which has a very narrow thing. And if you go outside of that focus, if you're talking about cosmic realities or the esoteric aspects behind those spiritual pieces in the religion, then, that's it, you're out. They caught you picking up sticks on Saturday, it's over. And so we have to take a look at that and see what part of the gift that we're getting in relation to this from the language, from the vocabulary itself. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep tonight here, and it's through the figure of Edgar Cayce and Helena Blavatsky as well, who are giving us this impression of Atlantis in this crucial period and the development of the automatons, and how this is very much what we're close to now with our cloning and with our automated robot army that we're developing. And I'm going to read something from a scientific journal. As you know, I tend to do this a lot, bounce like 10,000 years in the past and then into the future. But this is going to be kind of interesting because it relates directly to what we're talking about and the vision that Cayce is giving us here of humanity out of control, creating these basically Frankenstein creatures. Now, this actually comes from a scientific journal giving us a combined report from several scientific journals dealing specifically with human-animal chimeras, ethical issues about farming chimeric animals bearing human organs. Sound familiar? Hello, Edgar Cayce. Recent advances in stem cells and gene engineering have paved the way for generations of interspecies chimeras, such as animals bearing an organ from another species. The production of a rat pancreas by a mouse has demonstrated the feasibility of this approach. The next step will be the generation of larger chimeric animals, such as pigs bearing human organs. Because of the dramatic organ shortage for transplantation and medical needs for such a transgressive practice are indisputable. Well, no, they're not, because we can also say as a society, it ain't worth it. And like, we don't want a pig heart or, so there are questions with this immediately, and they're saying, well, it's inevitable because there's a great need, right? And this is how they kind of talk us into everything. So, at some point, there's not only is there going to be, the COVID op and threat ops and things of this nature, but there's going to be the like, oh, you're going to have to take part of this chimerical medicine to become merged in with this animal piece. The public must be associated with this ethical debate. Scientists and physicians have a critical role in explaining the medical needs, the advantages, and the limits. And of course, what happens is when those types of things are brought up in relation to, let's say, stem cells and vaccines or something of this nature, lines, when there are people that have religious objections to fetus tissue being used in medical products, et cetera, that type of conversation gets thrown out the window because, you have a situation where they want a certain type of conversation. So even a few years ago, when these scientific journals were putting this together, they were more open and saying, oh, we need an open discussion about it. So that's why the censorship just doesn't work for a society, and it blows up in its own face because it is only in the conversation that people can work those things out. And the idea of this tiny elite solving these types of human conditions, which go back, hundreds of thousands of years and have direct impact on humanity's future. No, you can't solve that at Davos. Sorry, Jeff Bezos is not developed enough as a being to be able to do that. Zuckerberg has devolved as a being. If anything, these people need to go back and I don't know, go to church and work at 7-Eleven to get some humility going, and just
collect garbage.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, we started with the garbage New York Times thing, and here we go. Garbage is in the astrological air. Okay. A little bit more, a couple of things from this fascinated me because they wanted to really stress this whole thing about chimeras in the stem cell research and therapy explanation. And they're celebrating it. They're like, scientific reality, a new age of farming human animal chimeras for organs may be upon us. But what ethical concerns does this pose? What barriers will it face? We need to make it happen, but can we convince stupid humanity to go along with us? The idea of a chimera is thought to date back to ancient Greek mythology. It's often depicted as a hybrid creature that has the head of a lion, a goat, and a snake's head for a tail. It has also been used to mean any fictional creature composed of multiple different animals. Now, that whole echo of these chimerical creatures is fascinating. And as I said, it comes up over and over again in the mystical teachings of anthroposophy and in Edgar Cayce. In Cayce's work, he's giving us the direct lineage of how this happened. These scientists got together, and this is what they did. They projected it. And I'm going to read a couple of things from Cayce before we're done here that'll give us an even closer idea of what he was getting at. So just a little more from this. Today, the term chimera can be found in multiple biological disciplines. In embryology, chimera is a term used to describe a combination of cells from different individuals. With better gene editing technology, scientists are now hoping that these chimeras may be the solution to one of the biggest medical issues. And it goes on to explain that altering DNA is really not a big deal because it's going to, kind of improve the breed, basically. So at a certain level, they're talking about, managing cattle in a sense. So the tone of this, although it had some flowery language on top, really gives you the kind of spook factor again when you're dealing with this. There's a spooky nature behind the scientific push for the AI transhumanist style takeover. And we have landed now with the possession of the technology. Unfortunately, we didn't hit with the technology at the right time when we had ethical leaders. We have a very unethical group, undeveloped group. I was talking about some of these leaders, but, really when you see them in conversation and they do interviews and stuff, they don't seem like they are operating with any deep understanding of, humanity or the human condition or anything like that. They're just talking about it in terms of thinking, wow, can I get people to get on board with this, like blue space origin, blue origin in space. And Musk uses the same language as well. He's another one. It's not an adult conversation. And so I think what we get with the really big super billionaires who are controlling so much of the tech is a very juvenile, very backward thing, but they're in possession of intense technology. And I would say subject to intense temptation to use that technology to dominate because they see people need the technology. We've all hopped on board. There's been an incredible innovation. We were all kind of sold into it, right? Social media, communications, computers. I edited a tech magazine for a decade. And I remember the fascination around the technology and wondering and I have a great interest in the technology, but the kind of ego attachment. I remember a story about this D chip that had come about that did all this incredible computing. And when they would bring it out, the scientists would revere it. And, that whole image of like these priests revering the Ark of the Covenant or something. And this is what they're doing. They're putting science on the altar of spiritual development. And this is the sick part of it and why, we can't go for that. No can do. Right. So some of the key people behind it were very, very interested in the Atlantis question. Marvin Minsky, I've brought him up because we only know about this connection through very strange means, which has to do with Virginia Giuffre and the fact that she went to court against Prince Andrew, and all these things came out about those connections relating to scientists, Epstein, Maxwell, being obsessed, and Epstein and Maxwell trying to be able to blackmail these scientists to help them with something. And that gets us into the Belial cult at the center of all this. They want to re-engage on that level as the Belial had reached a certain point, and they beat out for sure the Amilius group, but they took the whole island landmass continent down with them. So, their version of round two is not to learn from their mistakes. It's to get it right and really dominate. And there's kind of a sick, culture that was born out of MIT. I know a lot of great people from MIT, but Minsky, he embodies the whole, I'm an atheist, but I believe that we can create this AI substitute for humanity and it will think for us and we will merge with it. That whole thing. And I'm sure Minsky was a very talented guy. Early on, we developed automatons, and these were the earliest versions. And there was an echo out there in movies and science fiction about it. And we were actually developing these automatons. There are versions that even go back to the 18th century. They don't do that much. They have one in 1930 that answers calls. It's pretty impressive for that period of time. Fritz Lang's Metropolis, which gives us that incredible entryway in 1927 from Germany, of course, into this whole idea. And it's a futuristic piece about transferring someone's consciousness into an android. And, the kind of industrialists taking over and making the life for the average worker peasant unbearable. There's a lot of pieces here. There's like something in the unconscious of humanity that understands this crisis and this clash. So when we get into the chimerical aspect and the mistakes that were made, according to Cayce, by the Atlanteans, using this technology and creating their own beings, but arresting those beings in their own spiritual development by getting them trapped in these cyborg-style bodies. Well, it's really interesting. I'm going to show some examples of this in history, but I'm going to go to, there's so many people who cover music and media and really pay attention to that and all the symbolism that goes on there. I see it often, but in the case of the automatons, I found, of course, in Katy Perry's stuff, something that they were promoting that really, it's called Dark Horse. And it's quite fascinating because you'll see, actually, give me a moment here. It's over here. There's a whole group of automatons. And if we go a little further, she's surrounded in all these pictorials. And, I have a thing about artists. I figure an artist can do pretty much anything they want. And I don't believe in ascribing particular motives to artists around these things. But I do want to point some of these out in relation to who prepares these things for her and who might be putting this idea to humanity. This one I thought was particularly interesting given the Cayce readings and then looking at the combinations there of this human animal piece that Cayce talks about so much, and the hardcore Egyptian imagery, which is, the Atlanteans came into Egypt. This is how all this happened. And this is another piece of it. It's more of that animal mixed with human piece. Is there a cosmology that goes with that? You bet. But nonetheless, on the straight ahead level, we have, she's surrounded by all of these kind of somnambulist automatons. Okay, so the ultimate kind of chimerical mix is the Sphinx. And we have Cayce talking about the Sphinx and giving us that hint that it is the representation of the arc of humanity kind of overcoming this. It's the great mystery of the ages. It's the symbol of the Atlantean library and all the rest. But it is the human head on a lion body. And that significance there is that in Egypt at that time, they overcame the problem of the automatons by spiritualizing the entire process. And in fact, Cayce said it happened over 4 generations that those beings that were trapped in those chimerical things that had been brought about by the Atlantean scientists were freed and lived a full spiritual straight-on life. But that was the ideal, and that's what they achieved. But not all the beings participated in it. Some of them, maybe very strange things happened too, and that would probably be kind of a part 2 episode. There is a number of things that came out of this group that I was mentioning and from the late 19th century that was doing this esoteric art kind of theater mystery school, as I mentioned. This is one of them. And and this is Gustave Moreau, Oedipus and the Sphinx. And there we have the Sphinx asking the question, if you can pass my riddle, then you are going to basically become king, and you'll live too. But if you don't, you'll die and you won't be king. So the riddle itself is so fascinating, and so many of us know it, but it is one of those clever riddles, which is, what stands on 4 legs in the morning and on 2 legs in the afternoon and on 3 legs at night. And it's the big mystery. The answer to it all is a human being, a man, because, in the beginning, he's on all 4s as a baby. When he is full grown, he's on 2 legs. And then by the time he gets to be older, he's walking with a cane. But here we have the Sphinx commanding all the power there. And it is in the body, it's got mixed things. It's got wings. It has the body of a lion. Now, the same group who was doing these salons, and I'm going to say who was behind this art movement here shortly, but I'm going to give you the examples first. This is quite fascinating. This is, let's see here. This is Knopf, and I'm going to get into a couple of things in particular about him, but he was part of this esoteric art group, and here he is again bringing on this symbolism of the human being coming into this, and this is called the Sphinx Caress. Interesting too that in the background there are these 2 pillars, and they're blue pillars, and there's a kind of a Masonic overtone there for those who are looking for it. But also think a little bit also of how we look at things of the occult nature when we are getting this really hardcore, blast of it from the Katy Perrys of the world and things of this nature. They're using the exact same symbolism. When I looked at this, I thought, wow, that could be one of the clips from that video. And it's directly from this group that's operating in 1890 in France. So what's their story? There's a great deal of classics that come out of this artistic collaboration of these groups, and they are referred to as Lay XX. Yeah, what do you got?
Zach Robbins said, it makes me think of Bowie's Diamond Dogs album.
That's a pretty hardcore chimerical image. You can't beat it. Lay XX was a group of 20 Belgian painters, designers, and sculptors formed in 1883 by the Brussels lawyer, publisher, and entrepreneur Octave Mouse. For 10 years, they held annual exhibitions of their art. Now, this group, although the artists are Belgian, the group that put it together is in France, and they are the Salon of the Rosy Cross, Rosicrucian. This is very interesting. They're working with hardcore Rosicrucian imagery here. And the main founder, Peladon, who calls himself Josephine Peladon, which is interesting. His brother was, in fact, part of the Rosicrucian Society. But Peladon, is very interesting in a lot of ways because although he adopted much of the Rosicrucian imagery, etc., seems more like a left-hand path kind of a guy, kind of a centralist, shall we say. A little bit about him to kind of orient us to where this thread of esoteric information about chimerical figures, sphinxes, human mixtures, automatons are coming from. Peladon was born into a lion family that was devoutly Roman Catholic. He studied at Jesuit colleges, interestingly enough. His older brother, who we just saw in that shot, who looked kind of like Oscar Wilde, he was a homeopathic physician. And interestingly enough, he will die from accidentally ingesting strychnine. But he becomes a literary and art critic, and he will write over 100 books, Josephine Peladon. When we go into his background and his history, what he develops is these salons about Rosicrucian facts and imagery. And he starts to put together music on one side, he starts to put together plays on the other, and then the artwork comes right through the middle of it. And he is kind of leading it all, this huge, very hardcore, esoteric, artistic advance. And a lot of it is coming directly out of this symbolist movement, and it's directly related to this XX group. Now, the Order du Temple de la Rose, Croix, inspired Peladon to organize an outlet for his beliefs concerning the role of spirituality and idealism in art. And as an art critic, Peladon had been vocal in critiquing the dominant trends in French art, which included officially sanctioned styles promoted by the Academy and the Impressionists. Suddenly, this guy, his salons are doing fantastic. This thing is huge and it's everywhere. And it was enormously popular with the press and the public. But what happens is it's almost too much information in a way. And somewhere there's some short circuit where this gets shut down and it's left back there as an echo, even though some of the greatest painters of that period come out of this piece. And then Peladon is kind of relegated to a minor footnote role in history. And this whole piece of the esoteric Rosicrucian art revival thing that was taking place in the 1890s goes out the window. But throughout, the leftovers of the art it left behind are all of the chimerical images. And that is Peladon with some of his books, which I have to say are also strangely advanced for the period of time that they're talking about. So we have something there, which is a society that was working on this track, and they were bringing forward this chimerical art, and they were using these esoteric themes and these Rosicrucian themes. So when we get that echo now in our own imagery around transhumanist concepts, mixing of humans with animals, humans with machines, and all the rest of it, this one in particular is fascinating. It is called The Idol of Perversity by Jean de Ville. And I found out about Jean de Ville because he was close with Peladon, and he became the general secretary of the Theosophical Society in 1912. Let's take a look at this guy. This is his incredible artwork, The Idol of Perversity. The question is, where is he going with this, and where is the esoteric imagery around this going? Then, if we go a little bit further than that, he has a whole painting series about a medium going into these strange trances, because he's very familiar with the theosophical work and the psychic work, Blavatsky and all the rest. Look at this image. Just take a look at that. That is from 1892. You might be interested in that.
So cool.
So very unusual.
I love this art.
But we can obviously see there's this overtone, and there's almost a battle there in the imagery itself, because you can see it's infusing this spiritual piece, but it's also crisscrossing it with a sensualist, kind of a darker sensualism. And so we're getting there into two streams coming into this, and I feel like the original piece of bringing this Rosicrucian revival through art and through theater gets interrupted with this other thing, whatever it is that goes on, but nonetheless succeeds in revealing the chimerical nature of the artwork that they were passing along. That Peladon chapter, an art history of bringing forward the Rosicrucian ideas and ideals through art and theater and music, is huge. I could do a whole show on it, and I've been studying it for a while, looking at the nature of just how many tentacles this thing had and how it just disappears almost overnight. But some of the incredible artists are left as an echo, as an after effect of this whole thing.
Is there any relationship between this group and Crowley?
That's interesting. Crowley is originally very imitative of Peladon and then turns against him and criticizes him and calls him a moralist, which is kind of interesting considering the work he was doing.
That is wild.
We always know that incredible thing about Crowley when Jack Parsons is writing him letters about, hey, there's this great guy, you know, I was spending all this time with him, and, you know, I'll give you his whole background. And he's talking about L. Ron Hubbard, and Crowley writes him letters, and he goes, you know, I'd beware of L. Ron Hubbard, you know, the way you're making him sound, I don't trust the guy, you know, he seems like he doesn't have a moral compass. And you know that when Aleister Crowley is questioning your moral compass, you get big, big problems. Think about it. That's what we get with Scientology. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, going deep tonight on the chimerical and the Atlantis Automaton, the DNA piece mixed with this Belial cult secret. We're going to be taking your questions here shortly. I'll try to do this all so we can start questions about 10 minutes. How does that roll for you? Okay, let's see if I can do this. I've got more readings, but I want to inject this Steiner piece because I think it's going to give us, again, more foundation around this. There's a great quote by Steiner. If we do not believe within ourselves this deeply rooted feeling that there is something higher than ourselves, then we shall never find the strength to evolve into something higher. Absolutely crucial. One of my very favorite quotes from Steiner. Steiner, in looking back at what had happened with the Atlanteans, also attributes to them a very high technology, as Cayce does. And he talks about them having airships, and he talks about them being eventually the Belial group being the most advanced black magicians the planet has ever seen. And this is all under a kind of Ahrimanic spell. And in Steiner's cosmology, Ahriman is trying to take over in Atlantis, and then when that fails, he tries to take over in America, and, you know, he tries to spread through Europe. So Ahriman is just an ongoing force trying to convert humanity, and through very interesting stages like the Eighth Sphere, getting them trapped in a certain type of mentality, in a certain type of way. So the idea of the scientists kind of, you know, trapping people in cyborgs and things like that, you hear about this all the time. You know, you hear people like Musk saying, I'm going to transport my consciousness into a cube and they're going to stick the cube on Mars and I'll be there. You know, these people understand very, very well that you're not going to be able to do that because your body is the actual cradle of your consciousness. So it seems to me that there's something very strange, but very reminiscent of Atlantis in the talk of the transhumanists. And, you know, maybe Musk they're putting him forward in that kind of leading edge way, saying he was the richest man in the world and all these different things, you know, and he's got SpaceX and he's doing this. But when you get up to that level where Musk is, you no longer just a person saying things. So when we hear things about, well, Musk said this publicly or Musk said that, very often, you know, you can't really speak out of school when you're on that level, because in a heartbeat, they can cut all your space contracts because they're the government, you know, and you're out. So we have to be kind of realistic about this and what people talk about with the Twitter takeover and stuff. You know, I think it's reasonable to suspect that the people inside of that group had gone too far. And we've pointed out before that it was absolute red line, you know, line in the sand when they did things like censor a president of the United States and censor all of us for talking and the whole thing. But I think the exposure of it and how people could see just how obvious it was is part of the signature of this group that's taking over. And there are enough forces looking at them and saying, oh, you're going to turn 8 billion people against us, you better stop. And that's where I think we're seeing things like the New York Times article saying about the CIA op, oh, you know, the UFO stuff is trash. Or saying, you know, somebody takes over Twitter, this other guy comes in from outside, and what does he do? He gets rid of these people, you know, immediately and shuttles them out the door. I think we're seeing, just like during the Iraq war, And I want to make this point because for many years, Bill Moyers, the journalist guy, was in charge of the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations. And he, as part of that group, he ran documentaries as a journalist about the secret government and talking about the CIA takeover during the Reagan administration, and even echoing things about the CIA assassination of President Kennedy. That group has the same goals of taking over the world and having it be a one world order. But they have a very different ethic about how to do it. Well, ethic's not the right word. They have a very different model for how to approach it. And they don't want on the surface it to appear like these big people on top have come in and blown everything up. The group that was doing the cowboy, diplomacy during the Bush-Cheney era, and were going in and blowing up places for oil fields and things like that, that group embarrassed the first group, the CFR group. And so they fought and fight and vie for power. So the same thing is happening in relation to Musk and the Twitter people. And, so the Zuckerberg types, the hardcore censorship types, have gotten the big powers into hot water by trying to please them. And now they're turning around and saying to them, you better get these 8 billion people off our back. We're starting to suspect the whole thing is a fraud. So, you're seeing like little things come out like, oh, this guy's going to bring back regular intercourse in terms of social discourse. And so we have to be very aware of that, and I see a lot of like, thanks, Elon, for restoring my speech on Twitter. I'm not in there with that kind of hero worshiping of the transhumanist people. I think that they know that there are better people on the transhumanist level than others. But, at the end of the day, there are two groups trying to do the same thing. And so just like the Bill Moyers thing, he was all against Bush and Cheney going in and blowing up Iraq. But the CFR still wants the one world government. So they're both aiming for the same thing. They just go at it very differently. And I would say that the other group doesn't like being embarrassed, the ultimate group. They don't want to be shown up. Now, there are people like the World Economic Forum and like the leadership in Canada and the leadership in America who are going more and more on the record and being like, we're going to take over whether you like it or not. And we're the ones who will make the wise decisions and will protect you against, those terrible people who speak their minds, the deplorables and all this nonsense. That's the fascist wave. And so they're trying that. And, we saw Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau in Canada in particular. This was a model doing it. Jacinda in New Zealand was doing it very obviously, like, yeah, we'll take your rights away. Yeah. So there's an attempt there, but there is a group, sort of the major power group on the inside that doesn't like to be embarrassed on the surface. So this is part of the Musk piece that I think we need to figure in. So that's all I'm going to say about that. All right. Here's some weirdness for you. I mentioned Nostradamus earlier, and Nostradamus talked a lot about the period that we're in. And, some people can take it or leave it on predictions. What I think is interesting is he talked about a great king of terror that would come from the sky in 1998. And then in that period of time, you had all this talk about terror. And in 2001, you had September 11th and all the rest of it. So there was something interesting about him grabbing that date. In the Cayce work, he talks about 1998 as the testing period for humanity. And then he talks about, a gradual pole shift, Earth changes, and this whole thing about a real change that's going to take place. But 98, again, is drawn in very sharply. Now, in the Steiner work, you can find 1998 as well as the kickoff for all the weirdness that we're seeing. And I think it's important for us astrologically, astronomically, geographically, and all the rest of it, to take some of those dates and figure out what they would have, why they would be leaving this. So I'm going to read this now from Steiner, and it's him actually giving a lecture about what the apocalypse was really all about in the Bible, and Revelations and all the rest. And he's talking to priests, giving them this esoteric information, but they are, traditional Christian priests. They're not anthroposophists. So it's kind of an interesting thing that he's doing. But I'm going to read it straight up, and then we'll go through a little bit of it. This is Steiner now. When one looks at the ancient mystery wisdom, it follows from what was and is mystery teaching for the prophetic vision of future wisdom, that the human beings who, as it were, accept inner Christianity and spiritualized Christianity and look outwards towards the sun genius in connection with Christianity will accelerate their evolution and reappear at the end of the 20th century. The language is interesting, but let's keep going. For everything we can do now in this age is of great importance if we look at it from the viewpoint of eternity. It is of great importance if we grasp spirituality for the teachings and deeds of human beings in this age. It is a preparation for the great, extensive, intensive spiritual deeds which should be done at the end of the century. That's the end of the 20th century, this period again, 1998. After a great deal will have come before, which will be contrary to the spiritualization of modern civilization. After the second 666 stood in the sign of the great upheaval in Europe, which had been begun by the Crusades, and which had its outer fact in the appearance and destruction of the Templar Knights. Everything from the sun genius, which is trying to create a true Christianity, works on, as does everything from Sorath, who is trying to work against it. And we have the age of the third 666, 1998. Now, 666, again, directly out of Revelations, directly out of the Bible, and has that, kind of cliche thing when people say the mark of the beast, 666, and we come to know it as this really over the top thing. However, it's a very deep esoteric principle nonetheless. And the 666 being the mark of the beast, quite significant. And the idea that you wouldn't be able to transact without the mark. All that, is very deep in Christian culture, but it's also informative. And I'll go further. We're coming to the end of this century. We're coming to the end of this century when Sorath will again lift his head from the waters of evolution very strongly, where he will be the adversary of that vision of the Christ which appeared and prepared human beings will already have in the first half of the 20th century through the appearance of etheric Christ. It will then take almost 2/3 of a century until Sorath raises his head in a mighty way. And Sorath being the Ahrimanic extension, solar extension of Ahriman. When the first 666 went by, Sorath was still hidden in the evolutionary course of events. One didn't see him in external form. He lived in the deeds of Arabism, although initiates could see him. And Steiner ties him into distortions around the Muhammad religion. When the second 666 came, he already showed himself in the thinking and feeling of the tortured Templars. He will show himself before the end of this century already, and he will appear in a great many people as a being by whom they will be possessed. In the future, one will see people coming up to one, and one will not be able to believe that they are really human beings. They will develop in a very strange way, even outwardly. They will be intensive, strong natures, outwardly with fierce features and a destructive rage in their emotions. They will be intensive. They will have a face in which one will see a kind of beast's face outwardly. Sorath men will be recognizable outwardly. They will be those who not only ridicule spiritual things, they will fight in the most terrible way, and they will want to thrust it down into a cesspool. they will fight it in the most terrible way, and they will want to thrust it down into a cesspool. That is spiritual desire, spiritual aspiration. One will see that what is connected in a small region in present-day Russia, communism, will be inserted into the whole Earth evolution of humanity. So it's a rather dramatic piece. There's so many things to come through there with Steiner and what he's saying, including the time period that we're in, which kicked off apparently in 1998 and sets us up for this 21st century run into Ahriman. But what's fascinating to me is, again, the appearance. He's describing what the Sorath men will look like. And again, this is Sorath directly, the solar demon of the Ahrimanic force that he's talking about that comes through the technology in the 21st century and is that great challenge for takeover. So he's saying that these Sorath men will have a fierce appearance and that they will be intense and they will look like beasts. Well, that's pretty significant for a lot of reasons. And again, I go to the merging of humanity with technology and the types of beings that they're talking about, creating the types of things that we've seen through the automation and what they're building, that kind of robot clone army, as it were. Steiner's giving it to us in the language of the reason the Christian mystics left behind the symbol of 666. That's a lot different than just running off and saying, well, Satan, 666 and all this stuff. When we get that deeper explanation behind it, it sounds definitely completely different, doesn't it? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep here tonight in X Series 137. We are talking about the Atlantis Automatons and the DNA secret with the Belial cult, and Steiner giving us a little of that Sorath preview and what the kickoff date of 1998 was all about in the setup to the 21st century. He also had very major things to say about the exact time period that we're in right now, about that 100-year window, speaking in 1920, saying that in 100 years, anthroposophy would get a chance again to have that spiritual science be a larger impact on the culture. And it's interesting to think back on Steiner because he had actually thought that the mystery schools had failed because of World War I. I can only imagine what he would have said in relation to what happened in World War II. So I have more to add, but we're on time-wise. Let's jump into questions now. Miss Olivia, you're up.
Anders says, Sorath is an extension of Ahriman. DJ said, interesting. It says in Revelation 13 that the second beast, Sorath, is made in the image of the first beast, Ahriman, so it fits with the Bible.
Interesting, yes. Well, it's interesting to keep track of them all, but there's a reason why, and everything is kind of ordered in that esoteric cosmology, really, if you go deeper with it. And we do, in fact, see there's a reason, and I think it's a kind of a fascinating piece of the Steiner puzzle, which is he brings in Ahriman when no one else talks about it. There is, mention of it, of course, in the Persian mythology, it dominates, but there's mention of it in theosophy. Blavatsky comments it on a few times. But for Steiner to be like, oh, this is what's going on the technological side. This is the full kind of Mephistopheles from Goethe's Faust. And so he's giving us that hint to it. And he's saying the Luciferian objective also traps humanity, but it's different. So he's giving us two totally different streams. And then when you go a little further and catch up to Cayce's work, what is Cayce giving us? Well, Cayce is saying that the Belial group in that period of time, this is part of the problem, that you don't have to worry about a comet destroying Atlantis. It's the people that are at the center of it. They develop such incredible abilities that they start to command nature, and they know solar powers. They have the 2-eye crystal. They have the ability to blow everything up, back then. So the destruction of Atlantis, Plato doesn't say, well, they got hit by a comet. He says they angered the gods. And so, it was destroyed in a day and a night. So we have to understand that piece as well. It's not as simple as just ascribing it to some destructive astronomical activity. That's included. But you become more subject to physical disaster, to physical happenings, to the laws of the physical world when you are disconnected from your own higher nature, right? So this is what he's getting at, I think, with that. That's the great innovation of the Cayce work and the great innovation of Steiner's work. I've put this on the record before that Steiner really, when you get right down to it, is giving us 4 decades of work, and he's telling us, like, the heart of it is you have this thing, this Harmon problem. You're going to have this thing come through the technology and actually have an incarnation. And that's your big problem, because they're setting up an alternative evolutionary stream for humanity. And until we got here, you couldn't really see that. So even reading this, if you were looking at it 20 years ago, you might have had some idea, like, wouldn't that be interesting? But it wasn't quite as in your face. You wouldn't have thought, they really have the ability to do this now, and they're moving towards doing it. So I think that that's very significant in terms of the innovation that we're talking about with some of the public mystery school players. Yes.
Okay, Jay Vandervest, getting right down to brass tacks. So is transhumanism the mark of the beast?
Well, the way that they're using all these things have alternative uses. This is the nature of the thing. Atomic power, you can utilize atomic power to, warm homes in countries that are incredibly destitute. Or you can drop an atomic bomb to dominate a landmass. So, it's all in how the utilization of what it is. The transhumanism in the hands of these unethical, undeveloped people will lead to exactly the type of thing that you're alluding to. This is the nature of the problem of the period that we're in, which is the developmental stage has gone far beyond the wisdom stage. And that there needs to be, that everything has gone into a kind of a top-heavy thing where the development of the technology has come so fast, and not even the technology that they've let out. There's this incredible tape that CNN let out of Trump talking to Bob Woodward. I'm not sure why this didn't get around more, and it was interesting that CNN did it. I think they were working on the Trump is a madman thing. But there are these very interesting sessions where, Bob Woodward is talking. We know Bob Woodward from Watergate on is an intelligence mouthpiece, but he was talking about, here's my recordings of Trump, and Trump is laying into him talking about things. And he says, we have technology, we have weapons that the Russians don't know about, the Chinese don't know about. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, isn't letting this out also like a national security breach? I think we could call Merrick Garland in on Anderson Cooper. What do you think? Just think about it. But nonetheless, it's fascinating, and it is out there. So he's saying we have something else, totally different technology. We've been working on that other technology. We've had it for a while. Problem is, in the wrong hands, that technology becomes, a harvester of humanity on a command scale. And this is what we're teetering on. And what we saw with the COVID op and all the rest of it was an unaccountability, all these types of social programs and psyops to set the culture off against each other, ridiculous thing. Like, you see guys wearing masks while driving around in their car alone. It's a psychosis. And that's where I agree with the, when people talk about the mass formation psychosis, that's where they're correct. And I know that some people don't believe in that and think it's something that was ginned up by the deep state. But I do feel like there is a psychosis that humanity is prone to if you apply a kind of entrainment pressure to them. And that's how we've, this is the same thing. If you go back to the Ouspensky-Gurdjieff notes relating to the war in Russia and the Russian Revolution, and you go back to what they were talking about, what Gurdjieff was studying was the ability for these people to get whipped up and into a state of, these sleeping machines getting whipped up into hating or propaganda or whatever it happened to be by a small group, whipping them into this fury and this frenzy. So the idea he figured was, I'll awaken humanity. I'll give them tools to wake up, to get out of the sleep. And if they're not in the sleep, they won't be susceptible to the mind control. So we have a lot of things that put us to sleep in the culture, and that's not a healthy sleep, but it's a dulling, lack of awareness type thing. So I think that that's crucial for us to consider on that. Yes.
Jordan Banner, could it be that the recent protective V is the first step in creating a present-day chimera?
Yes.
I think we're all pretty clear on that one.
There's no question there are chimerical aspects to it. Any of the scientific investigations around pharmaceuticals, more and more they're bringing this idea in. And then, there's a kind of a, for want of a better term, a kind of cannibalism that's creeping in, and that is that centralized thing trying to strip away more and more humanity. How many layers of humanity can we strip away? And this becomes a great question that they're answering for themselves. On the side of humanity and everyday public society and getting through these things, I think what we have to understand is that civilization, up until the past 5 years, has had all kinds of different types of faults, including the fact of using an atomic bomb and genocide, and we've had all these things, Mao, Hitler, the deep state, presidential assassination, all these evils and things existed. There's no question. And so that humanity was engaged in a huge battle of evolution on that scale. But the problem is that over the course of the last 5 years in particular, the pace has accelerated because the people who are in command of the technology figure were not going to have this advantage indefinitely. And so they were like, let's use the cards while we have them. And this is part of the problem of the nature that we're in. And so people, even though they're accustomed to saying, well, there are things wrong with the world, et cetera, they don't realize the depth and the level that things are out of control on. And they're starting to, for sure. And so many of us in the ideas room, you understand it quite well. But in the general public, it's there. It's a flicker. It's flickering in their unconscious, like something wrong with this, But they haven't got that full message, the full thrust that these people are on an accelerated timeline, and it's related exactly to what we're talking about with the automatons, which they love this idea. They're working on them right now. We've seen them dish them out. And they want to make them citizens, right? And they want to create gender X. So, there isn't any separation between the automatons and the regular population. Well, who did that previously? And it caused a lot of problems. The Atlantean groups would bring in their automatons and say, hey, the native population, you're on the same level as our slaves. That sounds real familiar. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Deep tonight here in X Series 137 on the Atlantean automatons and how this relates to that Atlantean interference in DNA in that period. And also what we're looking at with the Belial cult and how that relates to the 21st century kind of push for the AI transhumanism. We're taking your questions here. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter. It keeps us in touch and gets around the censorship to a degree because we've seen over and over again people say, we didn't get notifications on YouTube for your show or whatever it happens to be. So that type of shadow banning occurs. I don't talk about those things, but I can only tell you that we experience it quite a bit, and the best way to get around it is to make sure that you're on that newsletter list. The other thing is subscribe to the show, support the work that we do here. If anything, we need to get behind the team on the ground who is, getting the answers for us. And so if anything, I think this is a period to double down and get behind our, kind of what Fitz calls our army, because if that is a war that we're in the middle of, and you can be darn sure that it is, then information is absolutely crucial. So get behind the work that we do on this program and support so many of the other wonderful people that we bring on to this show. Miss Olivia, now you're up.
Habardian. I suppose what DJ is putting forward is that the sons of Belial and the followers of the Law of One are reincarnating at this time, and we are they. This would explain the craziness of the elites, Belial. And Sanity Fair says, I really wish we would all remember we have been in this exact place before. Sure would save time.
Well, it's recurrence, right? On a grand scale. I remember that P.D. Ouspensky wrote The Strange Life of Ivan Osikin, which was all about this person who goes through these various steps and gets to a point in his life where he's full of despair and his life is a waste and he's going to end it. And then he comes back in a certain period and a magician tells him, I can send you back consciously into your life and you'll be aware of everything that took place, and you won't be able to change anything, but you'll be, I can send you back. And so he goes back, and little by little, it seems like a weird dream to him that he had this magician and all this stuff. This got turned into Groundhog Day, and it's interesting because Bill Murray apparently was very deep in with all of his weird problems that we hear about, but apparently he was pretty deep into Ouspensky and part of a Gurdjieff group. And there's a lot of people I'm finding out are associated with the Gurdjieff groups. And, I spent a lot of time with the groups enough to feel, the works, whenever you get around anthroposophy or the Fourth Way, the Cayce work, it's so expansive. There's so many different tentacles. I don't know if anyone can really ever be an expert on it, but I feel comfortable enough that I understand what the group work involving the Gurdjieff groups are. And it's interesting because people like Steve Bannon were deeply associated with that. Of course, Mike Flynn, we found out, was very deep into Elizabeth Clare Prophet's Ascended Masters work. This is interesting to me. There's a mystery school thread behind all of it. And, Steiner told us this in a lecture in 1919. He said that entire American political system, when Blavatsky came over here and tried to ingratiate herself with the mystery schools here, she figured out pretty quickly the whole political system was based on the mystery schools. And you had right-hand path and left-hand path. So you had people operating in, out of those spheres, having a certain amount of respect for the other's knowledge, but also being at totally cross purposes. And I think we're seeing a lot of that now, in fact. Yes.
Walter Bosley, how prevalent was Cayce in the 1920s? And Jay Vandervest wants to know, did Cayce say anything about integrating his work with Steiner's?
Wow, those are great questions. Here's the thing about that on the Bosley question. Cayce did come to intense prominence in 1912 as a result of a doctor named Wesley Ketchum, who said, this guy does incredible work, and I'm a doctor, and I'm going to bring him to this Boston Society of Doctors. And they would eventually take him into New York, where he was doing these tests, and they were testing him during these readings. And the New York Times picked up on it and put it on their homepage. And there was a huge wave of Cayce awareness going on in relation to that. Unfortunately, what those doctors did eventually was they got so curious about his trance state that they started to mess with it. And there were a lot of very interesting things about Cayce when he would go into trance. For example, wherever his soul body was going, this etheric body, astral body, to get the information, was still connected. It was like an invisible thread, was still connected to his physical body. So at one point, one of these doctors passed a piece of paper over Cayce's body, and he shut up. And then they couldn't wake him up. They couldn't figure out how to get him out of the trance. And they just waited and waited. And hours later, he came out of this thing. And they learned this another time. And, so this whole thing about he couldn't be touched while he was doing it. That was one. Secondly, one of these doctors was a maniac and was like, Casey's not really in a trance and I'm going to prove it. And as the story goes, he put something sharp underneath Casey's nail and wanted to, basically prod him and make him cry out in pain to be like, hey, he's not in a trance. It's a fake out. And he did the whole thing and he kept doing it. And then when they brought Cayce out of trance, he stayed in the trance, but when they brought him out of trance, he was incredibly furious that they had done this. And he never, ever dealt with those doctors or that whole scene, and the whole coverage and everything else dropped away. But Ketchum would stay around, and actually he would go down to Virginia Beach eventually and spend a lot of time with Cayce. So that, Cayce doesn't get his real major popularity until There Is a River. The biography comes out. That's 1941. He only has a few years left to live. And he lived most of his life incredibly poor. And he didn't make a lot of money from the work that he was doing, and spent half the time as a photographer until it became the readings, the bagload of requests for readings became so huge that he had to decide, okay, I'm going to go for this and stay with it. And so this kind of fantastic ups and downs there. There are some very fascinating stockbrokers that get involved with Cayce, the Blumenthals, and he ascribes really incredible things to them, that they have prophetic abilities themselves. And they are very interesting, but, and they start to upgrade and give him money to build a hospital in Virginia Beach and all these different things. And at a certain point, they tell him, we want you just to give readings for us. And he says, never, it's not going to happen. And they're like, oh yeah, we're going to pull the hospital. And in fact, they do. And they had become, now they were pretty wealthy stockbrokers to start with, but he, through the readings, had developed incredible wealth for these guys. And they had supported him in developing the hospital and all the rest of it. So there were, there's so many fascinating things that happen in relation to that. And what's fascinating is these real big wigs who took away the hospital and turned against Cayce. And they even went to write a book about being anti-Cayce. And they never released it, as it turned out. But there's an interesting footnote where Cayce's son, years later, after Cayce has died, and the son, Hugh Len, knew them very well, the Blumenthals, and they had helped him go to college. And when they had this break with Cayce, they showed up at the college and they said, pack your stuff now. We're not paying for this college anymore. You're out of here. And so it's like a weird spite game. And they try to sue Cayce for his house and all this nonsense. And, these guys were millionaires back then. So what took place was they took back the ARE in the hospital, and they tried to turn it into a hospital, a hotel, and with a nightclub and all this stuff. And it went out of business. That's exactly where the current ARE is today, but it's the same land. Interesting land, fascinating building. But long story short, at the end of their lives, Hugh and Cayce is jogging on Virginia Beach. He's Cayce's son, and he's running the ARE now. His dad has been dead for 5 years, and he sees Morton Blumenthal, the big wig stockbroker. He and his brother there, the masterminds, and they are flipping burgers on the beach, and they have a food stand, and that's how they're making their money at the end. So it's really interesting the way that these things work. And what's fascinating is, if you look back at the readings that Cayce gave for Blumenthal, he said the son that you're having could bring prophecy back. Blumenthal was Jewish, and he said he'd bring prophecy back. It would be like the Jewish religion would grow so much from the son. And he ends up marrying his secretary, and the son goes into a mental institution. So whatever was going to happen there, the great promise of Blumenthal's child, his prophetic abilities, never got realized, because he was so super sensitive because of his psychic activity that he ended up going into a mental institution. And the woman that he married was pretended basically to be a psychic. And he thought, he'd been working with Cayce all these years, and he's like, oh, well, I don't need Cayce anymore. I have this other psychic and I'll marry her. But his whole life went down the drain afterwards. So it's a very interesting story. But yeah, until you get to the 40s, Cayce doesn't really have any money. And that's an interesting thing. I remember there's a story by Harmon Brough, who I got to meet. Really interesting guy who worked with Cayce when he was 18 and 19. He was like an intern because his mother had written an article in like a kind of a Saturday Evening Post type article and on Cayce. And then somehow Brough became an intern down there. And he said there was a stack of envelopes that had come in and they all had money in them because they were people paying for readings. And Cayce pointed at the pile and said, find all the people who aren't members and send all the money back. And Brough was like, I can't, like you're living kind of hand to mouth here. Like you want to send money back, but you have to find out where Cayce was coming from in terms of what he was doing, that he felt, if these people were if they would join and understand the work that he was doing, then he could take their money. But if they wanted to just give him money for a reading, then he felt like he was taking something. So it's very interesting, Brough, and looking at it, but we need to understand the quality that somebody like Cayce put forward. And so he always knew where he was coming from, let's say, in terms of that. But yeah, that is fascinating. What was the other part of that?
I deleted it, but Cayce and Steiner.
Oh, right. Cayce and Steiner. There's two things on Cayce and Steiner. Someone came to Cayce and said, how do you feel about cosmic memory? Is it correct? It's Rudolf Steiner's book on Atlantis. And Cayce said, well, it's correct, but it's correct on a trend. It's correct on an individual viewing the Akashic record and pulling that information back. So it's very interesting the way that he put it. He certainly suggested that Steiner's work was beneficial there, but he is also saying, it's hard because you're translating it into language, in that case, 20th century language, coming out of the Akashic Chronicle. You're trying to translate an event that took place 10,000 years earlier. Just like the Cayce readings, there's an apprehension of it. So he's saying, yeah, it's correct, but it's on the trend of how he thinks about it. So that was interesting. And Steiner got brought up a few times. And Steiner, they had things over here called Campbell Villages. And I think they still have them, which are camps for mentally challenged young people. And so they did the Waldorf schools, they did those. But Cayce visited some of those Campbell camps, and they were doing incredible work, according to him. So he had a very, I would say, positive he had positive things to say about Blavatsky and the secret doctrine, talking about the high level that this was coming in on. And Tertia Morganum is one of the books that he recommended in the readings from P.D. Ouspensky. And he, at one point, he's kind of sort of mused to himself about Ouspensky when they were asking him about Ouspensky's book. And he said, oh, well, we find he was the guardian in the mount of the Mahabas. And then he goes off into this thing and he says, 7th year, 7th month, 7th day, 777, in talking about Ouspensky. Just think about how interesting, the unconscious mind of Cayce colliding with Ouspensky's kind of higher knowledge. It's very, very interesting. And there is a reading from 1941 where he gives this dissertation about how the unconscious, subconscious influences the conscious mind. And then he says, this is Ouspensky giving this. So Ouspensky is channeling through him. And when I was crisscrossing the dates, you can find out that Ouspensky died in 47. So he is channeling through Cayce while he's alive. So that's pretty interesting as well. So, when we're looking at some of those things, it's just absolutely fascinating when you get into the Cayce work. And the stories could go on forever. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Before we move off of Steiner for a minute, I just wanted to ask this one question.
Yes.
Into the Quantum wants to know, sometimes I think Steiner was an alien who was sent to help humanity and us. What is your take on Steiner? Was he on the spectrum? Was he? What does Gigi say about him being from another dimension, another planetary sphere?
Well, you know, he's operating in the spiritual world and bringing information back. The thing about Steiner that's so unique, in my opinion, is that he is a scholar and a genius, but he's also got the psychic part, and he integrates the psychic part and calls it spiritual science. So he's taking those two worlds, like we all have to in this era, and he's bringing science together with spirituality. This is basically what the world needs to do. So he becomes an incredible conduit for this information. But what he can do is he can take the trained intellect that he has into these matters as well. That is pretty unusual. You know, when I read Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, I have some quotes from it here. And Blavatsky is absolutely mesmerizing. Her work is fascinating. But, you know, in terms of organizing her thoughts, it's like a lightning bolt of information. Steiner's, it's a very orderly universe. And I think that makes the difference in Steiner's work from almost anybody. I have something that I wanted to read about Blavatsky. And of course, Steiner revered the work of Blavatsky and wrote many lectures about her and how powerful and important a figure that she was, even though he felt that she had been manipulated by different groups. And she was placed into something called psychic imprisonment at a certain point when they felt she was going to reveal too much. We have to remember in 1875, someone who was A, from Russia, and B, a woman, kind of commanding all of this attention around mystery schools. And also someone who didn't, apparently was a very straight shooter. She didn't have a lot of social graces that way. You can just imagine the type of reaction she's going to get. This is a little section in a book I'll read here briefly called King Thevatat of Atlantis. And it's something that she wanted to leave us. It's a story about King Thevatat. It's in Isis Unveiled. And so it gives us that hint about Atlantis again. And then I'll jump into this. We'll get right back to your questions. Is that good? Mm-hmm. All right. Tradition says, and this is Blavatsky now, the records of the great book explain the long days before Adam and his inquisitive wife, Heva. That's Eve. Heva is how they explain it. Where now are found but salt lakes and desolate barren deserts, there was a vast inland sea which extended over Middle Asia, north of the proud Himalayan range. Now, an island which was unparalleled for its beauty, had no rival in the world, was inhabited by the last remnant of the race which preceded ours. This race could live with equal ease in water, air, or fire, for it had an unlimited control over the elements. Now, these were the sons of God, not those who saw the daughters of men, but the real Elohim, though in the Oriental Kabbalah they have another name. It was they who imparted nature's most weird secrets to men and revealed to them the ineffable and now lost word. The word, which is no word, has traveled around the globe and still lingers as a far-off dying echo in the hearts of some privileged men. The hierophants of all sacerdotal colleges were aware of the existence of this island, but the word was known only to the Yahweh Elohim, the chief lord in every college, and was passed on to his successor only at the moment of death. There were many such colleges, and the old classic authors speak of them. This is where we get that mystery school. College is how she's referring to it here. There was no communication at the fair island by sea, but subterranean passages known only to the chiefs communicated with it in all directions. So there was no approach to Atlantis, this version that she's discussing it. As I mentioned, they have all these subterranean islands that connect. Tradition points to many of the majestic ruins of India, Ellora, and the caverns of Ajanta, which belonged once to these colleges, and with which were connected such subterranean ways. This is the underground connection. Who can tell but the lost Atlantis, which is also mentioned in the secret book, but again, it's mentioned under another name, pronounced in the sacred language. The great lost continent might have perhaps been situated south of Asia. If the hypothesis now so much doubted and positively denied by some learned authors who regard it as a joke of Plato's, if it's ever verified, then perhaps will the scientists believe that the description of the God-inhabited continent was not altogether fable, and they may perceive that Plato's guarded hints and the fact of his attributing the narrative of Atlantis to Solon and the Egyptian priests were but a prudent way of imparting the fact to the world, and by cleverly combining truth and fiction to disconnect himself from a story which the obligations imposed at initiation forbade him to divulge. And it goes on, so devastating and interesting the way that she puts it across. But what she's telling us there is that the Atlantis story, and the reason that it is taken as an allegory, is because Plato himself, when he's putting the story out there, realizes he needs to communicate this to humanity, but he's also an initiate of a mystery school, and he's pledged not to let this information out. So what does he do? He puts together the story, and he leaves it open as to whether it's an allegorical story or the real thing. And it's taken just for an allegory. And over again, no matter the trail of all the esoteric ruins in relation to Atlantis, we see traditional archaeology, wants to just shun it and say, oh, it's Plato's allegory tale. There was never anything of the kind. But if anything, the historical record now backs up Plato more than ever. So with that, Miss Olivia, back to your questions.
Zach Robinson would love to hear DJ's thoughts on Blade Runner and Bulwer Lytton's The Coming Race in relation to the automatons, robots, fallen angels, Luciferian or Ahrimanic technologies.
You could. I mean, I could have done this whole episode using The Coming Race as the springboard for this, because that also is telling you what's coming. What's interesting and kind of weird is that Bulwer Lytton reincarnated comes to Cayce for a reading. Figure that one out. I would say this, that the automaton story comes up. It's like it sort of surfaces from the human subconscious. And the unconscious is pulling at us in relation to things like the UFO file, things like our ancient past, things like our own abilities, because there's a connection there. There's an understanding. I've made this point before that if some general somewhere sees a dead alien that they pulled from wreckage, then on some level we've all seen it.
Mm-hmm.
And I recall that when Cayce goes into his trance readings, at one point, he's giving these answers for somebody, and the person goes, "Where are you getting the information that you're giving me on this?" Because they're amazed at the level of detail. And the person who is asking the question is a doctor. And his name is Harold J. Riley. And he was amazed because people kept coming to him with these prescriptions and, different things and saying, can you show me, hydrotherapy? Can you give me these different things? And he's like, where are you getting all this stuff? And they're like, they don't want to say I went to a psychic. So they say, oh, Dr. Cayce in Virginia. And at a certain point, Harold J. Riley says to himself, I have to go visit this Dr. Cayce because these are incredibly fascinating erudite readings. Like, what's going on with the knowledge this guy has? I'm going to go meet him. And then he goes down there and he realizes, oh, this is a psychic who's giving this information. Then he really has to alter his own worldview. But at a certain point, he's getting a psychic diagnosis. And it's so accurate that he's freaked out. And he says, well, who's giving this discourse? how are you getting this information that you're giving to me and all these other people? And Cayce says, I'm getting the information from the subconscious mind of the person asking the question. So it's your subconscious that is giving the answer. It's in my subconscious. It's in your subconscious. We have the ability to tap into that. Now, someone like Cayce gives us the ability to take that latent part and make it manifested in the physical world. So we have that. He's like a special tool for us, but we have that ability ourselves. So that's something to really spend some time on and think about in terms of the subconscious mind storing this information and how we tap into it. It's a great answer if you think about it. Yes.
Okay, Joyride. Did Tahuda speak of the entity of Ahriman entering the priests of Atlantis? And Christine Laurel says, did humanity invite the Ahrimanic force? Did we seek adversity to push our evolution?
Well, if you can say that there's a time when Steiner speaks positively about Ahriman, it does happen once or twice. And this is the only context that he speaks of him positively. It is in the fact that in that challenge of taking on Ahriman, we can win for human evolution the knowledge of Ahriman, which is important. And also in that own challenge, we build our own character. So that much is certain. On the other piece, you know, how did humanity get into trouble with this? It's quite fascinating when you look at the mystery school record, because what they're suggesting, I would say, as a common theme, almost universally, is that it was a rushing through of the process. And then those that were set up as watchers over humanity also, it was about patience. It was about wanting to see us advance faster. And so, for example, in the cosmology of anthroposophy, we were taught speech too soon. You know, and there's the whole kind of Adam and Eve story and the apple of the eye, and projecting ourselves into matter and getting locked into it. This is the great story that comes out of the Cayce readings, but it seems all designed to a certain degree. You know, there's a Cayce reading where they say, when did Jesus become aware he was going to become the savior of the world? And Jesus answers, and Cayce answers, when he fell in Eden. And he traces Adam directly to Jesus. And so Jesus falls as Adam and then comes back through all these different stages of lifetimes and then arrives as Christ. That's a pattern, an esoteric pattern that he's laid out there. Then when you go into the stories where it talks about Adam as Amilius, and Amilius intentionally allows what will become the Belial group to imitate him. So it had, like, these things are going to happen. He in looking, at least in the Cayce readings, in looking, Amilius looks down on humanity, which is getting trapped in matter. And a lot of these higher beings say, how can we help them work their way out of it? And so in Amilius's case, his solution was, I'll go down and they can imitate me, basically. And I'll get trapped in matter on purpose, and I will give them the pattern for how to get out of it. That is the Amilius Adam into Jeshua into Christ's story. So that's the esoteric tale of Christ. When you look at it, when we just go back to the Amilius piece, it's quite interesting because there's something associated with Amilius which has to do with when we were double-sexed and became separate sexes. This is a big thrust in the mystery schools. It's something that needs to be fleshed out and understood because it's not represented there in the scientific record at all. So, you know, they can talk about Neanderthal, but they don't talk about single-sexed beings. So therefore, we're looking at something that the mystery schools brought out, which we just have no knowledge of. I actually saved a quote of that. I'll read this quote on that. Let's see, how are we doing for time? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're here Oh, good. All right. We still have a little bit of time for the show and your questions. This is X Series 137 going deep now on Atlantis automatons and anything else you want to talk about. We'll do more questions. We'll do about another half hour. How's that?
Sounds good.
Okay, let's do it. All right. This is directly out of Cosmic Memory, which is my favorite of the Steiner books. And I think Knowledge of Higher Worlds is the gateway book into Steiner's. It's kind of like his hit album. But the cult favorite is Cosmic Memory. Okay. The external formation of Earth resulted in the body. The body assumed a one-sided form. The male body has taken a form which is conditioned to the element of will. The female body, on the other hand, bears the stamp of the imagination. Thus, it comes about that the two-sexed male-female soul inhabits a single-sexed male or female body. In the course of the development, the body had taken a form determined by the external terrestrial forces so that it was no longer possible for the soul to pour its whole inner energy into this physical body. The soul had to retain something of this energy within itself and could let only a part of it flow into the body. If one continues with the Akasha Chronicle, the following becomes apparent. In an ancient period, human forms appear before us, which are soft, malleable, quite different from later ones. They still carry the nature of man and woman within themselves to an equal degree. In the course of time, the material substances become denser. The human body appears in two forms, one of which begins to resemble the subsequent shape of man, the other that of woman. When this difference had not yet appeared, every human being could produce another human being out of himself. Impregnation was not an external process, but was something which took place inside the human body itself. By becoming male or female, the body lost this possibility of self-impregnation. It had to act together with another body in order to produce a new human being. The division into sexes takes place when the earth enters a certain stage of densification. The density of matter inhibits a portion of the force of reproduction. That portion of this force, which is still active, needs an external complement through the opposite force of another human being. The soul, however, must retain a portion of its earlier energy within itself. In man as well as in women, it cannot use this portion in the physical external world. This portion of energy is now directed toward the interior of man. It cannot emerge through the exterior. Therefore, it is freed for inner organs. Steiner there is giving us the evolutionary step of how this happened. But it happens with the appearance of Amilius. Amilius is kind of a catalyst for this, and he shows up 200,000 BC. So that gives us some idea of when this split took place in earnest. But then you hear also about pre-Adamites, the pre-Adam period, the period before the Adam and Eve story. So this is where, again, we have these things coming about. This is where the automatons are involved. They're even before Adam. So that gives us how much of a legacy we have from the automatons, the things in the Cayce Steiner Atlantis story. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Jimmy Kennemer, were the Anunnaki breeding automatons?
Well, that Anunnaki story seems like almost an after effect of the automaton story. Doesn't it almost seem like a legend of that story in a slightly different language? So I think it is related. And again, it has scientific overtones. But it doesn't, again, so much of what they do with the Anunnaki thing is to say, well, they created humanity, because they needed them. But what we're talking about with the automatons is an aberration. We're talking about a left turn that takes place when the Atlantean scientists, the Belial group, decides they want to make their own beings. And instead of taking the traditional channels of humanity, they start to integrate other things. Now, remember, the Atlanteans are incredible at what? Technology. And so they create a technical being, but then they also mix animal matter at times, and they start to make them for different things. Remember, some of them work in the fields, some are pilots. They had them doing everything. And when we think about, slavery and all the things that have come about, if you really tie it back to its earliest period, you're probably talking directly about the things in this whole period. So I think it is fascinating when we get our heads wrapped around it. Where do these patterns come from? This one might be very, very old indeed. Yes.
David Allen, why is Cayce or Steiner so rare? Why is there such scarcity of illumination generally?
Well, there are mystery schools, and they're not very public. But public individuals have to come forward to inform the larger culture of what's happening. I would like to believe there are a lot more of them out there than we ever hear about. And once in a while, I'll learn about somebody like that, or I'll have heard about somebody like that. Once in a while, maybe even meet somebody like that. But it is, I think it would be a heck of a lot better world if we had more of them. And but the incredible impact that they have, it sometimes feels like they are 5 people in one, doesn't it? Because, for example, when you look at the great work that came out of the Cayce work, I mean, it's remarkable. And he's regarded as the father of holistic health, but it's holistic health, it's Atlantis, it's reincarnation, it's psychic development. Living a life of prayer, it's esoteric information. While there's an entire incredible volume on the revelation and how it relates to the human glandular system. I mean, there is work there that was done over decades that came directly through a mystery influence. So we're very lucky to have what we got, for sure.
Yeah, the other thing is, how many do we need, right? Because
right.
I mean, are we utilizing what those people have given us already? Probably not. Are we practicing adequately? The other thing is, what is the in Meetings with Remarkable Men, what is the temple that he visits in the Caucasus?
The Sarmung Brotherhood.
Okay. So we know that there are hidden brotherhoods, right?
Yes.
Right now as we speak. So even though these people are not out in the world with us, they are holding our world together through prayer, through chanting, energy work. We are sane still because of them, I am certain. And if they risk coming out into the world, they risk defilement, right? Their energy bodies are fragile, right? I think that they are doing us more good staying where they are and projecting blessings to us.
It's very interesting. Defilement is very interesting.
Well, what is I mean, not in,
yeah.
when you hear this word biblically, I think our interpretation is one thing, but what it is soaking up negative vibes and having their energy be corrupted and contaminated by the energy of the world, right?
We've seen it. I mean, you can see it in someone who has a very negative attitude, and you interact with them, and their negativity starts to rub off on you. And you've seen very sensitive people. There are people in the world who don't have any of that sensitivity, and God bless them, right? But then you have people who have great empathy with other people, and they instantly become involved, with that. I remember, stories about Cayce and Blavatsky. One of the stories about Blavatsky, if you look at these stories, they're outrageous. Bennett gets taken for $1 million school that he's developed by a chain-smoking, card-dealing guy who claims that he is the top Sufi sent from the Brotherhoods to succeed Gurdjieff. Bennett signs everything over to him. And J.G. Bennett was, the top pupil of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. And then you have, Blavatsky getting used and sued by her housing staff, and getting used over and over again by con people. And then you have Cayce, you know, and he is like, for example, with the stockbrokers, they, you know, he loses everything. He's practically homeless when they're done with him. And at a certain point, he goes to New York and he gets set up. And these same stockbrokers, because they still have a grudge against Cayce, they send a policewoman in there to get a reading. And Cayce gets suckered in to doing the reading. And then they're like, hi, you're practicing medicine without a license, and put him in jail. And you think to yourself, these people are incredibly advanced. They're the top, right? They've given so much to us. But these terrible things can happen to them when they're dealing with low energy, low vibe people. So how does that work? Well, it is explained, interestingly enough, in Steiner's work when they're speaking specifically about Blavatsky and how all these things happened to her. They said, well, you know, if she was so psychic, how did she not see that this person was a con person and, like, you know, talked her out of her property? And he said, well, when you reach that level of psychic ability, that your actual skull softens, and your ability, your perception is so interpenetrable with the outside world that there's no room for deception in your thinking. You can't think and project, or lack of trust and things of that nature. And so that the price that they pay is that they will at times encounter people who will take advantage of this incredibly open channel. But we have to realize that in actual evolution, that if you reach a certain stage, you are just an honest person, and you are just doing things honestly. So people will take advantage of you. It's inevitable. And you want it to happen as little as possible. And I think what happens in the case of, you know, like Cayce and others, is sometimes there's an intervention. I've mentioned that story before about Cayce and the turban guy, but it fits really well here because Cayce had this being that would appear to him, this master, who would show up in a turban just in a few times in his life that he saw him. But it represents that brotherhood, the mystery school influence working with Cayce. But in one of these cases, here he is, this very trusting psychic person, which is how he gets all the ability in the first place. But this doctor who I mentioned earlier, Wesley Ketchum, and his father, who's in a great deal of debt, Cayce's father, start doing these readings, and they're getting the mail readings in, and they'll read the readings, and they'll have someone transcribe the readings. But Cayce usually had his wife and his stenographer do the readings. So, but in this case here, these guys are doing it. So the reading's over, and then they start to go into asking him about what can we expect to see as the winner at such and such a race, at this horse race, you know, where can, you know, and they start asking him about sweepstakes and all these different things. And he is walking around with migraines, and he can't give readings. You know, like, he can't do what he's supposed to be doing after a while. And he can't figure out what's going on. And these guys, in the meantime, like, his father's cleaning up his credit and all this, and he's trying to figure out what's happening. And so he's like, you know, I'm going to basically go to my photo studio. I'm like, because I can't give readings, I'll try to do some photography. And he's in his photo studio, and this man comes in who's in a turban and who looks like an Indian Raja. And the man comes up to him and leans into him, grabs his arm, and says, "You're with the wrong people." And Cayce is completely freaked out by this guy, then turns around and walks out the door. Cayce flips out. He goes through the door, and he asks the receptionist, "Do you see where that guy went?" And the receptionist's like, "I didn't see anybody." And this figure is kind of representative. You know, there's a kind of a safety valve that exists when you do this work, but nonetheless, you're going to be taken advantage of. But how fascinating, I think, in Cayce's life. And what he did from there on was he had just his stenographer Gladys and his wife do the readings. He never allowed his father or Ketchum to get involved. And it was interesting because Ketchum, Dr. Ketchum, if you go into his past, and you know, I've seen this name as a thread. Ketchum's a very important name in all kinds of esoteric scenarios. And I would say that Ketchum played a dramatic role in bringing Cayce to the public. But unfortunately, this last chapter is kind of a blemish and all that. What's fascinating is that Ketchum will take all that money that he was making off Cayce in those post-reading questions, and he makes it a ton of money, and he spends it all on Miss Georgia, who is this incredible beauty. And he is giving her all this money and all this stuff. He finds out at the end of this whole track that she is actually planning to marry someone in English aristocracy. And that's the end of Ketchum and his dream and all this stuff. So, it's very interesting the way that these things work. But I think that there was this force that was looking out for Cayce, who was telling him, you can't continue with this. The most dramatic story is Cayce going through this incredible ordeal, getting thrown in jail for practicing medicine without a license, and just thinking, I'm giving this stuff up. I'm not going to be a psychic anymore. I'm just going to do photography 24/7. And, he had an incredible backlog. This is 1931. He'd already done incredible work for 3 decades. And he was like, why should I bother doing this? And he's had it. And we can really relate to this. So many people, I think, who are, that type of person, and especially in the psychic field, because you never know what you're going to get. And he's walking down the street. This is in New York. And he walks down the street, and the turban figure shows up again, and he's staring at him. He's coming at him. Cayce's like, what is this guy doing? And he bows down before him and says, nothing. He just is bowing before him and totally silent. But the implication is, you've really made it, like, you really can suffer through this, then you're actually teaching me. Now you're the master. And I think that's very significant. That story, somebody tells from seeing this happen. Someone who was going to meet Cayce goes looking for him, and he sees this huge crowd around this guy. And you can see the turban guy now. It's like the first time he becomes visible, and he is bowing there. And the guy who came to meet Cayce grabs him out of the crowd, because all this crowd is wondering what's going on here. So it's like a huge crowd he has to rescue Cayce from. When you get into that level of that interaction of these esoteric principles, and you're exercising those principles, when you get challenged and you go through things like what he was going through, then it's going to seem like it's not worth it. And so this is just the nature of that sacrifice and learning about it. But it is an individual thing. And in Cayce's case, he needed the signal. And that guide, which had been with him through these different things, had to really show him, look, you're on the right track. You are doing this. Now you're the teacher, you're the master, and I'm bowing to you because you have the ability to do your work and go through this incredible experience. So I find that incredibly significant. Yes.
The Buddhists of Boston sports. I feel like I know some, quote, synthetic people. I thought the V was to get rid of them and have organic people live. Do you or me or DJ think there are remnants of automatons living right now?
Well, it's interesting about the automatons. And I think this is why this has come up. I've always been fascinated by them, but the more that I hear about what they want to do, the more it sounds like Cayce's automatons to me. So one of the things that happened when I was talking with Joseph Farrell, and we're going to have Joseph back on the show pretty soon, but this was a couple of years ago, and he was talking about how he felt that in that great run-up to 9/11 and afterwards the TSA and all the rest of it, that it was all designed to find a particular physical type for a reason. And we went round and round about, could it be, they're looking for Pleiadian physiology, something of this nature, whatever it would happen to be. And in the back of my mind was, isn't that interesting? I wonder if they would be looking for this early alteration of the automatons. But it wasn't until I read about the automatons in relation to them coming to America with the Atlanteans that it started to appear to me that there was a much deeper level to the story about them, because the dramatic thing that happens in Egypt is under Rata's guidance, and he works to cleanse them of this DNA interference that the Atlantean scientists have laid on them. But the group that went to America, I don't know if they ever had that. And it's interesting because there's someone in here. I'm going to read that reading if I can find it easily. There's someone in here in one of these readings who very interestingly will say, I'm writing about this. I want you to give me more detail about it. And, what I want to know is, how did the process work of basically creating in their system a whole system and getting rid of the DNA influence? They didn't use the word DNA then because Cayce died in 1945, but get rid of that scientific interference. And he said, well, it took 4 generations. Well, think about that. I mean, a typical generation now is what, 40 years. So it's pretty interesting. 4 generations it took to clear them of that influence. So it's a long-term program. So did a lot of them fall through the cracks? Probably. One of the things I brought up with Gigi Young in our last interview, and she has some things that I think will come forward from this. I'm very excited for what she might do with it. But it's this idea of this kind of like weird mutant gray piece, and how everyone automatically assumes, well, they're visiting from some other planet with advanced technology. It's a worthy consideration. Was there a group here that retained the technology and didn't kind of evolve with humanity? And this becomes, I think, a very interesting, and it goes into a little bit of that Mactoni's book about the crypto-terrestrials, which is a very small book, but packs a lot of punch in terms of its questions. And it's the kind of depth I think we could get to in the UFO field if they get rid of the CIA malarkey. And that's just it. I mean, they'll have us going around in circles being like, Jim Semivan is a contactee. I mean, that's the level of insanity. They want you to get involved with their weird projections of people. And they're going to bring Lou on to make you come to Jesus. Come to the alien Jesus. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Okay, we're going to take 2 more questions, and then we're out of here. Give us your best shot.
Oh, there's such... well, if I could do 3, I'd be happier.
Okay, you got it.
Okay, so there's a collective here. Peter Bayonne, did the automatons impact the human genome? And Dale Power says, are we the automatons? How would we know if we were? Along those lines, B. Nickel, is Bigfoot an automaton?
This is very interesting. I'm going to tell you what's interesting. You know how I occasionally talk about the transcenders and how I learned that, this NORAD officer, ex-NORAD officer, had sent me this prediction about they were going to see on October 13th, 2010. And I was working for Lifestyle magazine. I wasn't even doing this work at that point. And so he sent this, I think it was email. The more I think about it, I think it was an email press release. And it said, well, there's going to be this sighting over New York City on October 13th, 2010. And I was like, that's interesting. It's putting it out there like that. And that prediction was all over the place. And then it happened. And it is a very unusual sighting, which no ufologist will touch. I've talked to the best ufologists and the people that are very well known in the field, and they give a blank stare whenever I show them the facts of this story. And it's very strange. It's almost like there's a kind of a hypnotic thing around the story not to follow up on it. I don't get it. To me, it was one of the best stories because, oddly enough, they had a CBS camera that was set up to shoot the sky that day. And in the morning, they were waiting for their interview subject to come on, and the camera was aimed right at the sky, and boom, there it was. So we have really good footage of it, but tons of footage of it, early, like this cell phones from 2010, And they weren't great shots, but the CBS TV camera was incredible shots, and tons of people saw this thing and had impacts from it. And there were all kinds of flights canceled. When I looked into it, it just got deeper and deeper, and I wondered about it. Well, those transcenders, it turned out, the ex-NORAD officer died almost immediately after predicting this. So I couldn't talk to him, but I did find out that he was talking with this group. And it was actually someone who was operating like a Cayce-style trance channel. His name was Rick Thurston. Fascinating guy, great guy. And I spent about 12 hours talking to him about all these things. But if you look at his work, he talks about Bigfoot as a leftover from the Atlantean experiments, and said there were very few of them, in fact. And but there's a direct answer to your question in the Rick Thurston work, and I think it's in the Challenges of Change book by Stan Fulham, who's the NORAD officer who passed away. Unfortunately, Rick Thurston passed away like 6 months later. So both of those guys were gone in a flash, but they made quite an impact, and I was thankful I got to spend some time with Rick, who was the real deal, certainly the real deal. Yes.
Wendy Eater, is DJ saying we are seeing the equivalent of a mafia-type war between the families? And Diane Chadwick, DJ, do you think that there are higher dimensional Christed beings here on Earth fighting this major dimensional war, World War III and Galactic World War III, for the rescue and removal of the ascended bloodlines?
Galactic World War III. Whoa. Well, look, Steiner talks about the war of all against all. It's so interesting because he's like casually giving a lecture, and he's like, but of course they're going to have to deal with the war of all against all. And that includes all races against all races, all age groups against all age groups. It's just everybody against everybody. And it seems to me like this is exactly what they're laying the groundwork for, right? So that's a big thing to be avoided. But in terms of the space impact of these things, I think that it's incredible. There's a great deal of evidence that we've been visited by cultures that are like us in their own systems. But there's also a great deal of evidence that a lot of the things that we think are going on that are space oriented are actually related either to advanced cultures here or to interdimensional experiences here. So it is a lot of things to sort, because it would be a lot easier to just say, well, Betty and Barney Hill were picked up by a craft from Alpha Centauri, they were looked over, and then those guys went back home. What I will say about Betty Hill's story, and why I think the Hills are highly believable, is that Betty said, look, they're people, and she had that kind of matter-of-fact frankness about it. Like, she had to deal with them. She remembers them. They're people. They're just different. So the question is, who are they? When I was talking to John Warner, he said, well, these aliens could have taken the Nazis for a time travel thing on one of these ships. They could have popped in, abducted Betty and Barney Hill, which is why there's mention of how one of the aliens looks like a Nazi. It is a weird reference. He also says that one of them looks Irish, and this thing about red-haired aliens is interesting. There's so many. It comes up in the T.T. Brown story, and his daughter told me that when he was, when they had this craft land in the backyard, and that the people who got out looked like, basically, like religious figures, but with red beards. So there's something very deep, I think, with that. What I'm going to do to kind of round out the question around the automatons is read you this very short reading by someone who wanted to write a book on the subject and came to Cayce, try to get some very specific information about the automatons. Thank God, finally, somebody asking directly about them. Here we go. For my book to be written on my Egyptian incarnation, this is the 294 series, by the way. When people were losing animal appendages through the Temple Beautiful, I found Thompson's Mysteries and Lore of Monsters, which gives historical cases of mermaids, cyclops, centaurs. Did these man-animal combinations exist in large numbers in 12,500 BC? Cayce answers, there's some confusion as to the conditions here. Many existed in the period, but the loss of the animal appendages was through operative forces in the Temple of Sacrifice in Egypt, not in the Temple Beautiful. There's two temples there, and this is very significant. We'll go further. There was also the preparation of individuals through reading and through the application of the laws of diet as to make such appendages be gradually released entirely from certain types of individuals. Only those who had mixed with the thought forms had same, you see. Okay, so something is being mixed with thought forms, and this is why we're getting this. So whatever this process is of altering Atlantean DNA has to do with thought. So there's a scientific process, but there's the ability to bring and manifest things through thought. And this is how this is working. I think that's a major clue in there in the Cayce readings. So again, he says, only those who had mixed with the thought forms had same, that is, whatever kind of appendages, chimerical, animal mixture, the whole thing, mixed with mechanical parts. Please describe the ceremonies in the temple, which the human-animal combinations could in a lifetime lose a tail, change a paw to a hand, or an animal body, or head to a human. As indicated, surgery, we would call it now. So they're employing in the Temple of Sacrifice this incredible process to bring them, make them into whole beings. How much transformation from the animal to the human could be completed in a lifetime? Little, save in the offspring, by the change of thought, diet, and the operative forces in the third or fourth generation, it was completed. So the beings that went in Egypt that were automatons would have this process completed in 4 generations. That's quite a commitment. One last piece from all of this, and this has to do with Rata. Now, Rata, again, is the Egyptian priest Rata that cleanses through the Temple Beautiful, the automatons. He's also coordinated with all the Atlanteans to store the Hall of Records under the Sphinx, and he also brought this group in from the Caucasus Mountains and brings them in, and they take over Egypt. But they do it in a bloodless coup, basically. And he suggests to them, look, just tell the king that you don't want a war and that you're coming to take over, and that you're going to integrate with the group. So this Rata is he's regarded as like a sort of a freak mystic. So the culture that he's in, that comes out of the mountains, which basically comes out of Iran and comes down to Egypt, he is being led by a vision. And he's trying to lead the leader of his land to not go into Egypt violently. But there's a couple of interesting points here that they make about Rata. Here's one. It's the 294 series again. The records that are apparent in the inner self of the entity of the body in the present, from that as seen and recorded by Rata the priest. In giving the interpretation, we must find there are many peoples, even nations, that were influenced by the material activities of Rata. That the entity came into the land Egypt with others and had come for a purpose is evidenced by that which has been given. He came at those people and was to be later an earthly sojourn of the entity as a leader, a man of unusual abilities as well as appearance and manners of conduct. Rata looks strange, and there's a wonderful artist. We used her image, Nanette Christ, who does all these wonderful Ascended Master images. This is her image of Rata, which is absolutely spellbinding, but I think she captures it there. A priest after Amilius. The entity came into the land of Egypt with others. He chose rather the peoples that were to enter into the land. Rata was the son of a daughter of Zu, Z-U, that was not begotten of man. So Z-U, the daughter, so either he's saying there that he's a daughter of Zu, not begotten by man, but Rata is not begotten by man. What seems to be is that Rata doesn't have an earthly father. He's a daughter of Zu, and that the mother somehow has him, and there's no earthly father. Not begotten of man. In the entrance, then, he came rather as one that was rejected by the people about him. Forever has there been that question, which has been the experience among people who had formed any associations of home. And he goes on to talk about how Rata, what he gave to the Egyptians was this concept of home, and to develop a home. And this is kind of a great spiritual leap. And so it goes on further. And I'd say one of the key things that we learn about Rata also is that he realizes that the point has come for the next root race to come in, and that he is part of this process of going from the Atlantean root race into the Egyptian. And so Rata is a central piece when thinking about the automatons, because he's trying to cleanse what the Atlantean scientists have done to them. Now, in terms of the ones that he got his hands on to work with in the temple, those people in 4 generations were changed and became fully human and all the rest of it. There are readings where he gives readings for people who previously were one of these automatons, which means there's some process where there was a soul habitation in this cyborg that these Atlanteans had cooked up. Very strange and interesting indeed. Miss Olivia.
So when you were talking about transforming the automatons, Jason May said, change the morphogenetic resonance field. And thank you said CRISPR.
Wow. That's pretty, I mean, that's really on the right track.
Probably a combination.
You notice how the one thing that Cayce mentioned in there in both instances was thought. So that they had to change their thinking. And when they changed their thinking, the ability to do this was possible. So he mentioned surgery and other very practical things in there, but there's something about thought. And then earlier on, he says they were mixed up with thought forms. So when we think traditionally about thought forms, it thinks, we're imagining like what Ledbetter did, when people think angry things, it comes out looking like this. When they're listening to music, that thought form looks like this. It's a wonderful book that he did with Besant that has all that. But what Cayce is referring to as thought forms here are beings. So they're beings that were brought into materiality by Atlantean scientists utilizing some aspect of tech that combined thought with scientific process that created things. So this is maybe, when you hear about the Musk thing that they want to do with Neuralink and all the rest of it, they realize that thought becomes the progenitor of action and creation. And they then develop that into a technological process. I remember a story by a guy who had been funded. This is a really interesting story too, and he confirmed it for me, but he'd been funded to do a study by Nixon. And he was going to do a documentary, and all these interesting things happened as a result of him putting this together. It was on UFOs, and he had total access to the Pentagon. And when he went in there, he's walking around, and this is in 1974, late 73 and early 74. He's walking around in there, and they have already soldiers who have earmuffs on and are watching a screen and are already projecting onto the screen what they are thinking. So if they think about, the Great Pyramid or something, that's showing up on the screen. If they think about Starry, Starry Night, boom, on the screen. So that technology existed to transmit thought through electrodes onto a screen in 1974. So it's 50 years later, almost. What do you think they've gone now with that? And do you think something like Facebook, for example, has got up to the point of reading our minds? I think they can. And I think that they will, as part of the technology, be able to reach right into your thinking. So this thought aspect, again, for me, is something the mystery schools were letting you know. It's all about thought, and get overwhelmed as much with the technology as you want. But really what it comes down to is your thought process, which I think is a great secret, but it's out there in the open now. Yes.
Last question.
Yes.
Okay.
Drum roll,
Making
please.
It a big one. Wizard Fruit. Did Cayce, Steiner, Blavatsky prophesize the apocalypse in a similar way?
Well, Steiner, as I said, if you look at the theosophical work, it literally is very positive. And it says, we're going into a period where the sixth root race takes over. They're psychic. They understand each other. The world teacher shows up and things go off into that future. And, they talk about Atlantis rising, by the way. I've mentioned that this is a central tenet in the mystery schools we need to pay attention to now, because it's what these people are all about. That is the leadership, the controllers. They understand that aspect. We need to understand that aspect. But what's going on there is they have that wonderful projection into the future. Steiner is like, yes, but there's a huge war with Ahriman, who comes in and becomes embodied through technology and has an actual incarnation. And he's, remember, kind of like the main dark astral demon drag on humanity. So if he's incarnated, that's pretty bad. And he said the only way that he could win is if he catches humanity unawares. That's a central tenet in anthroposophy. So we're in, as of 1998, we're in that period. Cayce calls it the testing period. Cayce always talks about Earth changes and the pole shift as a gradual, not a cataclysmic impact. People have wanted to make him prophet of doom and all that for years, because he did talk about California sinking into the sea, for example, massive earthquakes. There's a reshaped map of the US that happens after all these earth changes, and it's pretty hardcore. So if we're headed for that, it's going to be a lot of change. But that's very much like what the Atlanteans experienced as well. Apocalypse itself, that's a deep one. Probably we'll do a show just on the apocalypse in its deeper esoteric pinnings, because there's a point in Cayce's study of the Revelation when they talk about the 144,000 souls that ascended, all this piece out of Revelation. And he says that it's about the cells, the 144,000 cells, that make up kind of the new human after they've spiritually evolved. So you see, we're looking at this, and we can talk about it, physical universe and all the rest. But when you get down to it over and over again, the deeper you get into this work, the more you realize you're discussing deep spiritual development and its physical interface, more than, say, a comet coming in from outer space and causing a apocalyptic scenario. And so it's a fascinating piece. And when we hear people talk about Armageddon, remember, they mentioned nuclear Armageddon and all that in the Biden speech. It's a ridiculous thing. All you have to do is introduce a peace process, but instead you want to go up there and make statements like that. But what's interesting about Armageddon is that if you go into the Cayce readings, if you go into the mystery school jargon generally. They say that Armageddon is a war that takes place in the air between the souls leaving Earth and those returning to it. So these higher souls are coming in trying to change things on Earth, and they're being blocked from entering. So that's Armageddon, literally translation, war in the air. Now, war in the air can also sound like, an alien invasion, because it's a lot of different connotations. But as Cayce explains it, it is between the souls that are leaving and those that are coming in that are being blocked. So that's a pretty deep process. And that's something which I think goes a level deep on the esoteric side, which you have to be committed in order to want to understand it and then follow through with what that is. So, and with that, Miss Olivia,
let me ask you a follow-up question on that. I wanted to get around to this. Bill Monahan said, and we win by somehow redeeming Ahriman. Is Ahriman redeemable? And what does that even mean? What would that look like?
Well, in Steiner's cosmology, here's what happens. Basically, the challenge is, and here's how it works. And I'm sorry if the terms are unfamiliar, but they're in anthroposophy. Vulcan in anthroposophy is a sphere, like the eighth sphere, that we're developing through our higher aspirations. It's a higher aspiration of humanity. That warmth creates a new Jupiter. New Jupiter is like New Jerusalem. It's the next Earth. It's where the soul wave goes. That's the evolution, the cosmology in Steiner's work. There's a force, the harmonic force creates the eighth sphere instead, and it's a diversion. It's a diversion of that path so that we evolve back to Earth. And it's a backwards thing that makes us more base, more material, and all the rest of it. And under that state, the harmonic forces contain humanity. That's the basic story. It goes much deeper, and I suggest you explore the literature that Steiner left on it. But in that clash of facing off against Ahriman, what would happen is, we would see through it, we'd develop the character to overcome it, and we would move on to New Jupiter. Those forces that wouldn't accept it, like Ahriman, if it doesn't accept that higher spiritual realization, it goes into something that Steiner called bitter moon, which is, I think it just gets enveloped in its own eighth sphere. And it takes as many down with it as it can take. So that's the nature of the thing. The nature of the force we're talking about with Ahriman, you can speak about it singularly to a degree, but it's a force. So we've personified it because it has a personification in material things, but it would be hard to say, Ahriman will make this decision at that point. I don't think anyone would know. But generally, if you look at this kind of setup, a lot of this makes sense because it does. If you go deep on the esoteric Christianity, that gives you the formulation of something like Revelation, for example. New Jerusalem's very important. And that all of this, development that's going on is for spiritual evolution. And then what does it do? It creates the next stage, and the next stage in anthroposophy is New Jupiter. So that is kind of the development of it. I hope that answers the question. In my opinion, the harmonic aspect of the battle that Steiner was seeing, we're in it now. Like, this is I think it goes deeper than this. It goes a lot deeper, we can only imagine, but now we're in it. Whereas I would say people who, people who were, say, in the late 20th century were not at this level, this stage of Ahriman's presence. But I would say this, it's pretty interesting because all of the alien abductions take place, and some of them in this period of like 50 years between 1948 and 1998. I know they go back further, but just looking at that as the phenomena we became aware of. And then it almost seems to stop, doesn't it? And you don't seem to find people who are having those experiences. It's almost like the aliens got what they were looking for genetically before this battle goes down. And again, aliens, that's a term in quotes on that. Whoever's operating those that level of technology and interfering with humanity wanted to get to us before all this stuff. That's significant, I think. And
pure human.
Yes.
Uncorrupted DNA.
Certainly a lot less corrupted. Yes.
Let me ask you, as far as the warmth that's necessary to create Vulcan, or is New Jupiter?
No, that's Vulcan. Okay. Yes. And it's all the same thread.
Does Steiner go into specific techniques, meditations, practices?
Yeah. How to Know Higher Worlds gets you. It's the opening gate to that. And an outline of occult science is kind of the large scale overview of it. The piece that I would mention that when discussing the warmth is he's discussing a etheric warmth that takes place due to thought and emotions around a particular thing. Like when he was talking about the second coming, he mentioned, well, that has to do with the second coming of Christ in the etheric, when we have set the stage by having, as a world, the right perception of Christ. So that goes very deep, as far as etheric body and things of that nature. But you can imagine that it is the setting up of the emotion. And again, I think so many of these things come down to thought. And so those are warm thoughts, aren't they?
So honestly, looking around, what should we be doing that we are not doing? If you could encourage people to do a couple things.
Well, I spend the time, working on these things. I think being in the flow of that information adds a great deal, and it informs your own intuition, and your own intuition gets a chance to come forward, in fact. And I think that's really the crucial aspect.
Okay, but everyone, especially in the ideas room, very knowledgeable, very informed. But the information is stressful, and it's, I think, everyone is frozen as far as what to do externally. And also the fear keeps us from kind of, I think, cultivating the kind of yin emotional warmth practices that might be helpful to us coping with everything.
No
so
question.
There's sort of inner practices and outer practices, outer disciplines that we should be doing.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I think that you have it exactly right. It's important not to get caught up in the whirlwind. And, I was talking to someone who was going off about the extent to which things are so upside down. And it is, it's amazing to so many people. And you want to see people aware, but you don't want to see them hypnotically sort of feeding themselves paranoia and things of that nature. That's not what the information inform. And by the way, the information that I was referring to isn't stressful, right? It's all like the stuff we've been talking about tonight. It's not stressful so much as it's enlightening and maybe puts us on a different awareness level. But I think that there are, especially, and we should watch for this in these shows in the alternative field, for either the 2 minutes hate thing or something getting us whipped up. You got to be real careful of that and really checking sources for things. But for me, in looking out at this, the most important thing is to not to over identify with the kind of heated emotions of the thing, and to really kind of step back and say, what are your own thoughts versus what's happening out there? Because there's a lot of things that will want to suck you in one side or another. And you can't from an uncentered place absorb anything. So you could have the greatest knowledge in the world, but you would have to be centered to receive it, just like a good meal. You'd have to sit there to eat it. And, it's very important, in my opinion, to have that centered space. So absolutely. You make a great point. Miss Olivia, outstanding tonight. Great ideas room. Unbelievable. And you're up.
Okay, I've got a bunch of super chatters to thank. Gil and Joy R, Jim Sarge 3ID, Norman Smith, Eurythmics Fun, Nitos 49 Persiste, Erica Swenson Elliott, Bari, Undestroyer, Mark Petrie, Bob Bindert, Havardian, Charles Cheatham, Kelly Ross, Violet Lotus, Sarah Jane, Matthew Goodpaster, Lev Polyakov, Kid Lee's 9, Jennifer Walters, Melissa Buffington, Jennifer Hart, Jay Vandervest, Shy Dan, the Buddhas of Boston Sports, and a cult fan. Thank you so much.
Wow. Incredible. Thank you so much for your support, and keeps us going. And to all the people who support the program, our subscribers, and the great people in the Ideas Room, thank you. It allows us to be able to do the research and bring forward the program. We have some great things coming up for you in November. Huge, major interviews coming up, X-series episodes. There's a documentary coming out, and we'll have some events news coming up. So just remarkable things for all of us to enjoy. And I want you to know that I enjoy so much of your own comments and the things that you send to me, and just, the questions and the ideas from the whole thing. This is something that we're really doing together. So I very much appreciate it. And it's great to spend the time here with you on this October post-eclipse, but going into an eclipse night on a Friday.
Season, yeah.
I'll do a couple of shout outs here. My huge technology here. Here we go.
By the way, before you do that, there was no way I could fit this in, but Johann Wolf said DeSantis rhymes with Atlantis. Just in case you never figured that out.
DeSantis Atlantis. Jesus, gang, I like that. Be a boss in the Matrix. That's good. Carl Jung, right on. Heidi Ann, thank you. Love you too. Lisa Frequency, keep manifesting love. Buck Rogers in the 25th century. Yes, that's really true. Najat says, I can't wait. What's she talking about?
About the following up on all the cool art that you shared tonight.
Oh, yes.
Who knew?
Yes, this is telling you, there's something major that was missed back there. The chimerical symbolist movement. Infinitum Neo, thank you. Wow. Gigi's out there. It's great to see a fantastic show she did last night. She went there and you have to watch it. Golden Girl, thank you. Whew. Unbelievable. Mantis, yeah. Well, that's a good question. That's going to have to be addressed because I've seen very important, what I would consider important researchers talk about that one. And then behind the scenes, people have mentioned things about that to me. So I consider it important. Najat, great to have you out there. Fantastic to see you. Elijah Muhammad Ali, thank you, sir. Blavatsky was enlightened by a Tibetan monk, so I have to respect that. Isn't that interesting? We often forget. I think Blavatsky still takes a lot of heat, the way that she did then, and she really opened up so many doors. And it's remarkable the impact that she had. She's a remarkable person under incredibly difficult circumstances who brought forward incredible things. So we're very much in her debt. Yes. Thank you, Kate Garcia. Love the content you provide. Outstanding. Thank you to both DJ and Olivia. That's Melanie K. I know Kate's out there. Kate's great to see you. Timothy Guessing.
There's been a lot of discussion about Christ in the chat tonight.
Isn't that interesting? Mm-hmm. Well, if you're dealing with Cayce and Steiner, that's esoteric Christianity. Cayce was a Sunday school teacher, for heaven's sake. I mean, he was a Sunday school teacher who talked about reincarnation and psychic experience and things. And it got him thrown out of a number of churches, especially when he was in the South at that period of time. Mr. Wolf, thank you, sir. It's great to have you out there. So we have to admire his courage as well, going through that with his family, and probably his neighbors thinking that he was a Satanist or something, because he was lying down, going into a trance and saving people's lives. I mean, this is how it works.
Can I throw one last thing at you?
Yes.
Okay, so earlier, Silver Fox said Elon was selected to ride the fence, folks.
Yes.
They have to give you, quote, hope as we are progressed into full spectrum slavery. Sorry, but it's too late to stop it. I don't like the idea. I resist the idea that it's too late to do anything. And I think that's partly growing up watching Star Trek. And Kirk would never say never, right? He just, he would ride things out. He'd play it out as long as he could until he found a way to save the Enterprise.
Yeah.
Well, whatever it is, you just never accept failure, right? It's just not an option. So I think that we should adopt that as a stance. That is a winning stance.
Oh, I absolutely agree. Mm-hmm. He didn't believe in the no-win scenario. Mm-hmm. So, it's interesting. Someone mentioned Carmen Bolter out there. We have to also remember the people that, we've come in contact with, have had a great, incredible impact in this field and have done things that lifted the entire field. And so we stand on their shoulders to a great degree. Probably I first learned about Carmen Bolter when I was in my early 20s, maybe. And getting to meet her, know her, and have her be a contributor to this show is like a dream come true. So, I've been incredibly lucky in that regard to meet someone like Carmen. And it's tough that we lost her. And especially when she's on the cusp of doing her greatest work. And, but there are those reminders that you can picture someone in the middle of this conversation. It would be someone exactly like Carmen. Or, you think about Jim Mars. I used to spend time at my kitchen table on the phone, and my phone would go dead from the length of the call with Jim Mars, and just listening to the incredible things that he was imparting. And so we've lost these people. We will never have those conversations again, but they made that incredible impact. And for me personally, I mean, just completely off the charts. So I'm very grateful, just like I'm grateful tonight to be here with you. And with that, I think I miss Carmen and wonder who will carry on the work she did. I know. Well, they'll step forward. They will step forward. I'm sure that will happen. And we all do. It's been great to have so many of you here. Remember to go, if you're new, especially, to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our newsletter, and make sure you stand up and be counted. We will be back with you next week, and you might get a special, yes, Kobayashi Maru. You might get a special breaking news, special update for things that are going on, because I have a feeling that between now and next Friday, the world is just not going to hold.
Think?
But we'll be here anyway. Have a fantastic weekend, and we'll see you all soon. It says end broadcast, but after all,
never really ends.
Miss Olivia has it right. Never really ends. Never let it be forgot. Once there was Camelot. We'll see you soon.